Let us imagine for a moment that history, as we have inherited it, is not complete, but more like a mosaic with crucial fragments missing. There are theories suggesting that the greatest deception of humanity is not buried in myths or fairy tales, but hidden directly within the official timeline itself. One of these theories whispers of a secret blood, a lineage that did not end at the cross but was carried across generations, concealed within monastery walls, veiled in legend, hunted by emperors and popes. It is the notion that the Holy Grail was never a chalice at all, but flesh and blood, a family, a heritage that still breathes today. Such an idea moves like a shadow between the lines of chronicles, an echo that refuses to disappear no matter how loudly official history speaks. The question is not only whether it is true, but why so many centuries worked so hard to keep it silent. Sometimes silence itself becomes the loudest proof. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. If you stand at the threshold of forgotten centuries, you begin to sense that history is not a clean line, but a palimpsest. A layered manuscript written and erased again and again, with traces of older words showing faintly beneath the new. One of the strangest of these erased lines is the story of the Merovingians, the long-haired kings of early medieval Europe, and the suggestion that their disappearance was not an accident of politics, but a deliberate suppression, an act designed to bury more than a dynasty. It begins with a moment of silence in the year 679, a silence that followed the murder of King Dagobert II in the forests of the Ardennes. Chroniclers disagree on how he died. Some whisper of a spear through the eye, others of a knife in the throat. But they agree that what followed was even stranger than his death. The ink dried up, the words ceased, and his bloodline seemed to vanish into the soil as if the earth itself swallowed the evidence. Monarchs do not simply vanish without outrage, without resistance, unless someone very powerful needs them to vanish. And that is the heart of the suspicion, that Dagobert was not killed merely as a king in a game of power, but as the final visible branch of something sacred, something that threatened the foundations of the Church's authority. The Merovingians were unlike other rulers of their age. Their identity was entwined with myth as much as with politics. They never cut their hair, believing it carried a mystical force, a vessel of divine sanction. To shear a Merovingian was not simply to humiliate him, but to strip him of legitimacy, to rob him of the aura that made him more than human. Their people venerated them not just as kings, but as semi-divine figures, capable of visions, healing, and a strange communion with the sacred. To their subjects, they were not warlords propped up by papal approval, but symbols of an older union between earth and heaven. The dynasty's very name traced back to Merovec, a half-mythical ancestor said to be born of the sea, perhaps from a creature that mingled the human with the divine. Legends claim he was conceived when his mother was visited by something not entirely of this world, and though the detail is absurd to modern ears, in its symbolic texture it signals the claim to a lineage set apart from ordinary men. Dagobert II carried this aura, and his son Sigisbert IV should have inherited it. But Sigisbert never ruled, never appeared in coronation or chronicle. His name slipped out of record as though intentionally erased. Some accounts hint that he fled south into the region of Languedoc, where strange traditions of heresy and secrecy would later take root. Others imagine he was sheltered by monks, living under another name, carrying his bloodline like a hidden relic. The silence is suspicious, for it is not the silence of obscurity, but the silence of suppression. Records surrounding his death and his son's disappearance have the feel of something scrubbed, of a paragraph cut from a larger text. The theory that follows is audacious but persistent, that the Merovingians claimed descent not merely from kings and prophets of the Old Testament, but from Jesus of Nazareth himself, through Mary Magdalene, portrayed in canonical Gospels as disciple, but in Gnostic whispers as companion, partner, perhaps even wife. The Gospel of Philip refers to her in terms that in Greek carry intimations of intimacy, calling her koinonos, a word that can mean companion, but also partner, even spouse. This, combined with legends of her fleeing to southern France after the crucifixion, pregnant with the child of Christ, seeded the belief that the sacred blood continued not in heaven, but on earth, through children, through descendants. If true, then the Merovingians were not just kings by conquest, but heirs to the blood of Christ. That is not merely inconvenient for the Church, it is devastating. For the entire authority of the Church rests on apostolic succession, on the idea that spiritual authority passes from Peter through bishops and popes, sanctified by tradition. But if there were a bloodline, if divine authority flowed through veins instead of through ordination, then the papacy itself would be undermined. Faith would shift from institution to inheritance. The Church could not permit such a claim to stand, not if it wished to remain the mediator between man and God. A Jesus who died and left behind only teachings is a Christ the Church can control. A Jesus who left behind a lineage is a living challenge, a rival to every doctrine. It is in this light that Dagobert's murder takes on a different hue. If he was eliminated, it may have been less for his politics and more for his blood. And if Sigisbert was erased from history, it may have been less oversight than design. The Carolingians who followed, with Charlemagne as their great ornament, were sanctioned by the Pope and loyal to Rome. They owed their crowns to the blessing of the Church, unlike the Merovingians who claimed holiness by birth. The transition was quiet, bloodless, strangely compliant. It is as though the stagehands had changed the scenery while the audience blinked. One dynasty was ushered off and another ushered on, and centuries of memory were rewritten to make it seem inevitable. But traces remain. In the archives of the Bibliothèque nationale de France appeared in the 20th century a curious set of documents known as the Dossier Secret, claiming that the Merovingian line survived in hiding, protected by a secret society called the Priory of Sion. Many dismiss it as a hoax, but within the flourishes lie details too obscure to dismiss entirely. Precise references to tombs, heraldic lineages, obscure family trees. The documents placed the survival of Sigisbert IV in southern France, where his blood quietly merged into local nobility. The theory insists that the bloodline did not die. It simply went underground, preserved by guardians who believed that one day it might surface again. This notion found echoes in the rise and fall of the Knights Templar, who some claim unearthed secret scrolls beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and returned to Europe with knowledge too dangerous to reveal. Their sudden wealth, their mysterious rituals, and their abrupt destruction by a French king, indebted to them all, lend themselves to the suspicion that they were not merely warrior monks, but protectors of a hidden truth. Inquisitors accused them of heresy, of worshipping strange heads, of secrets too great to speak aloud. Some whispered that what they protected was not gold or relics, but genealogy, the proof of a living bloodline. Skeptics scoff, of course. They point out that no hard evidence exists, that these claims rely on fragments and coincidences. Yet the persistence of the myth, the recurrence of symbols like bees, long hair, and fleur-de-lis, the silence surrounding Dagobert's tomb, and the disappearance of his heir all generate a sense that something is missing, that the record is too neat, too carefully pruned. History is full of silences, but this silence feels intentional, like a locked drawer in the middle of a well-organized room. So Part 1 leaves us standing before that locked drawer, aware of the questions but without the key. Was Dagobert II killed to erase a bloodline that threatened the authority of the Church? Did his son survive and carry forward a lineage that still flows quietly today? And if so, why has so much effort been devoted not to disproving it, but to silencing it? The deeper one looks, the more the silence feels like an answer in itself. History, when it chooses to conceal, often leaves behind not clarity, but absence. And sometimes absence is the most eloquent testimony of all. When you step into the long shadow cast by the fall of the Merovingians, the quiet is almost more telling than the noise of their reign. Their disappearance was not accompanied by rebellion or thunderous revolt. Instead, it was like the sudden dimming of a candle in a vast stone chamber, a hush that invited no questions. That hush is worth examining, because in silence we often find the outlines of secrets too disruptive to name. The early medieval world, fractured from the ruins of Rome, was a place where myth and authority intertwined, where kingship was not merely political, but saturated with symbolism. The Merovingians embodied this atmosphere. Kings who claimed vision, whose hair was never cut, whose power seemed to come as much from aura as from army. For centuries, their long-haired mystique made them both revered and feared. Yet the record that survives about their decline speaks less of a dynasty that failed naturally, and more of one that was carefully, deliberately dismantled. Consider the role of the mayors of the palace, the chief administrators who slowly accumulated power at the Merovingian court. By the 7th century, these figures were already controlling armies, managing estates, and guiding policy. Kings remained symbols, but the mechanics of rule shifted into the hands of bureaucrats. Among these administrators rose a family that would become far more famous than the kings they served, the Carolingians. Pepin of Herstal, then his son Charles Martel, and later Pepin the Short, all carried the authority of the palace while the kings dwindled into decorative relics. This transfer of power, though described in chronicles as pragmatic, bears the marks of orchestration. Rather than wiping out the Merovingians in a bloodbath, the Carolingians gradually rendered them irrelevant, trimming their sacred hair, sending them into monasteries, and letting memory fade. It is almost too neat, too surgical to be coincidence. What stands out is not the shift itself, but the manner of it. Had the Merovingians simply lost their grip, one would expect battles, betrayals, or exiles. Instead, they were gently folded away, their lineage diluted into obscurity, while their symbols were systematically dismantled. The Church supported this transition, lending legitimacy to Pepin's claim and blessing his coronation. In that blessing lay the bargain. The Carolingians offered loyalty, and the papacy offered recognition. The Merovingians, with their awkward claim of sacred descent independent of Rome, were erased. This alignment of Church and Carolingians created a new foundation for European kingship, one rooted not in mystical blood, but in papal approval. The question that lingers is, why the need for erasure rather than simple neglect? If the Merovingians were powerless, why cut their hair? Why shepherd them into cloisters? Why take the trouble to turn saints into forgotten names and myths into heresy? The simplest answer is fear. Fear not of what they could do militarily, but of what they represented symbolically. A king who believed his blood was divine, a dynasty that whispered of descent from Christ, could not be tolerated in a church that claimed monopoly on sacred authority. Better to fold them into silence than risk the fire of controversy. And yet, fragments surface. In the 9th century, a monk named Hincmar of Reims described visions in which Dagobert II appeared as a martyr, unjustly killed, his relics resting beneath a church far from Paris. For a brief time, he was even venerated as a saint, a status quietly revoked centuries later without explanation. His feast day disappeared, his cult extinguished not by argument, but by omission. Tombs associated with him were sealed or relocated, and his absence in the grand necropolis of Saint-Denis remains a curious anomaly. Nearly every French monarch lies there, their names carved in marble, but not Dagobert II. It is as if his presence was too dangerous to enshrine among the others, a reminder that could never be permitted to endure. Legends of his son, Sigisbert IV, add another layer to the puzzle. Oral traditions in the Languedoc speak of a child spirited away, hidden by monks, and raised under another name. Villages in the Pyrenees whisper of descendants who lived quietly, marrying into local nobility. Such stories are impossible to verify, but their persistence suggests that people sensed something unspoken beneath the official narrative. When stories refuse to die, they often guard a kernel of unease, a truth too disruptive to declare outright. This unease later resurfaced in documents that shook the imagination of the 20th century. The so-called dossiers secrets, deposited in the Bibliothèque nationale of France, claimed that Sigisbert survived and fathered a line of descendants preserved in secrecy by the Priory of Sion, a society sworn to protect the bloodline of Christ. Scholars debate whether these papers were forgeries, a clever fabrication by Pierre Plantard and his associates, but even if fabricated, they contained obscure details about tombs and heraldic devices that remain uncannily accurate. More curiously, they surfaced decades before the explosion of Grail theories in popular culture. If they were hoaxes, they were astonishingly prescient. The Priory of Sion itself, whether real or imagined, functions as a lens through which to view the strange silence around the Merovingians. According to the narrative, their mission was not to seize power, but to safeguard a lineage, to preserve the sang real, the royal blood, until a time when the world could understand it. Whether one believes in their existence or not, the very idea resonates with the absence at the heart of Merovingian history. When you find a gap in the record that large, your mind naturally seeks guardians, conspiracies, explanations for why such silence was enforced. Meanwhile, symbols connected with the Merovingians continued to reappear in odd places. The bee, sacred to them as a sign of immortality and resurrection, vanished from use for centuries, only to be revived by Napoleon as an emblem of his empire. He claimed it symbolized industriousness, but others saw in his choice a deliberate connection to the forgotten dynasty. Over 300 golden bees had once been found in the tomb of Childeric I, Dagobert's ancestor. To Napoleon, adopting the bee was a way to link himself not to the Carolingians or the Bourbons, but to something older, more primal, more enigmatic. Why reach for such a forgotten symbol unless it carried a whisper of power? It is these oddities, the missing tombs, the sudden revivals of forgotten emblems, the vanishing cults, that fuel the suspicion of deliberate cover-up. It is not the presence of proof, but the persistence of silence that gives weight to the theory. Silence does not usually erase kings. Silence preserves mysteries, and mysteries endure because they touch on something vital, something feared. If Dagobert's blood was seen as dangerous, it was not because of his reign, but because of the claim embedded in his veins. So Part 2 widens the lens. The fall of the Merovingians was not simply the replacement of one dynasty with another, it was the rewriting of legitimacy itself. In their place rose kings who owed their crowns to Rome, who were bound not by sacred blood, but by papal sanction. The cost of this bargain was the disappearance of a story too powerful to coexist with orthodoxy. And yet, despite all the efforts of chroniclers and councils, the whisper endures. It curls through village legends, flickers in odd symbols, and rests like a shadow behind the great cathedrals of France. If it were nothing, it would not need to be silenced. That is the paradox. The more completely something is erased, the more deeply it invites suspicion that it mattered. And the Merovingians, once kings of vision and miracle, now live only in suspicion, in rumor, in the silence that history could never quite perfect. The silence that settled over the Merovingians after Dagobert's murder is not just an absence of words. It is an invitation to look more carefully at the fragments that remain. Because when something is hidden, it often leaves behind distortions, irregular outlines where the erasure could not quite reach. These traces appear in myths, in symbols, in obscure chronicles that escaped the editorial hand of Rome, and in the ruins of rituals whose meaning was never entirely lost. To understand why this dynasty was so carefully muted, we must step into their world, the half-pagan, half-Christian fabric of early medieval Gaul, and sense how their authority differed from the rulers who replaced them. The Merovingians were called the long-haired kings, a title that was not poetic but literal and sacred. Their flowing hair was not vanity but theology, a visible marker of sanctity and legitimacy. To shear it was to sever their right to rule, to turn them into mere mortals. This belief did not arise in isolation. It drew on older Druidic traditions, where hair symbolized spiritual power, on biblical echoes of Samson, whose strength was bound to his locks, and on a wider ancient idea that the body itself could carry divine imprint. Thus, the Merovingians embodied a fusion of pagan and Christian currents, presenting themselves as kings, not because the church anointed them, but because their very being radiated holiness. This was dangerous, because it meant their legitimacy bypassed Rome. A Carolingian king required papal blessing, but a Merovingian required only his own birth. His authority was innate, untouchable, as though sanctioned by heaven itself. The rituals surrounding them reinforced this mystique. Chronicles speak of Merovingian kings having visions, dreaming of their own fates, and performing acts of healing by touch. Gundrum, one of their line, was said to have cured a leper with a kiss, and was later canonized. Dagobert. I dreamed of his assassination years before it occurred. Skeptics might dismiss these as hagiographic exaggerations, but within the texture of the time, such stories made sense. Kings were not just rulers. They were conduits of divine presence. Their people looked at them not as administrators, but as sacred figures bridging heaven and earth. The ancestry of the dynasty added to this aura. Their founder, Merovingian, was said to have been conceived when his mother encountered a sea creature while bathing, half man, half beast, or perhaps something more symbolic, a spirit of the deep. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, but in mythological terms, it marked the bloodline as otherworldly. To be born of the sea was to be born of mystery, of forces older than Rome and deeper than Scripture. This legend lingered alongside the Christian claim that their blood reached back to King David, to Abraham, and, in some whispers, to Galilee itself. Whether one believes in these claims or not, what matters is how they were perceived. The Merovingians were not ordinary rulers. They were wrapped in layers of myth and sanctity that could not easily be dismissed. Clovis the Barthur, the dynasty's most famous figure, exemplifies this duality. In 496, he converted to Christianity, baptized in Reims in a ceremony that legend says was marked by the descent of a dove carrying holy oil from heaven itself. This vial of oil, known as the Sainte Ampoule, was preserved and used in later coronations, linking every French king to that miraculous event. The symbolism was clear. Clovis was chosen not just by bishops, but by heaven. And yet, beneath the Christian veneer, older traditions clung. His tomb was said to contain golden bees, symbols of immortality and resurrection, buried like guardians around his body. These bees would vanish from heraldry for centuries, only to reappear under Napoleon, another ruler eager to link himself with primal legitimacy. The bee, the long hair, the claim of visions, these symbols created a dynasty whose authority was mystical, not institutional. That is why their erasure mattered so much. To remove them was not just to change rulers, but to redefine kingship itself, shifting it from the realm of myth into the realm of papal approval. And the Church understood the stakes. A king who did not need the Pope was a threat, no matter how weak his armies. If the Merovingians whispered of descent from Christ through Mary Magdalene, then the threat deepened into theological crisis. The Church could not coexist with a bloodline that embodied what it taught to be metaphor. Yet for all the efforts to suppress them, the Merovingians did not vanish cleanly. In monasteries, fragments of hair were preserved as relics. In villages of southern France, oral traditions spoke of queens with red hair and sons hidden in cloisters. Symbols associated with them, bees, fleur-de-lis, five-pointed stars, appear carved into stone in places where no record explains them. The whisper of something sacred lingers, like incense in an abandoned chapel. And centuries later, when documents like the dossier Secrets surfaced, claiming the survival of Dagobert's line through Sigisbert IV, people found in them not just fantasy, but echoes of something already suspected. It is here that the story brushes against one of the most provocative shifts in religious imagination, the redefinition of the Holy Grail. Traditionally imagined as the cup used at the Last Supper, or to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion, the Grail became in some readings not an object but a lineage. Sangreal, the royal blood, a living vessel rather than a chalice of stone. In this interpretation, Mary Magdalene herself became the Grail, the womb that bore Christ's child, the protector of his blood. If this was true, then the Merovingians, claiming descent from her, were not merely a dynasty, but the embodiment of the Grail. The quest for the Grail, then, was not a search for a cup, but for a genealogy. This idea, heretical and explosive, explains why stories of knights searching for the Grail are often stories of worthiness, of lineage, of who may approach it. They are coded allegories, not of relics, but of inheritance. To hold such a possibility is to understand why silence was necessary. If the Grail was a bloodline, if the Merovingians embodied it, then the Church had to bury them beneath layers of neglect. To acknowledge them would have been to destabilize doctrine itself. And so history bent around them, chroniclers shifting language, saints desanctified, cults suppressed, symbols erased. The Merovingians were not destroyed in fire, they were drowned in silence. Yet silence never fully erases. It leaves absences that hum louder than words. It leaves missing tombs, misplaced relics, unexplained symbols. It leaves the sense that beneath the polished surface of official history, another story breathes, waiting. Part 3 closes with that breathing, faint but undeniable, a reminder that erasure is not the same as extinction. The Merovingians may have been pushed into the margins, but their story lingers, restless in the shadows, refusing to vanish completely. To follow the Merovingian story deeper is to walk into the forests of memory where silence becomes thicker, where even the leaves seem to hold secrets. By the time Dagobert II had been erased from official record, and his son Sigisbert whispered out of sight, the dynasty was already sliding into myth. Yet myths are not invented out of nothing. They cling to bones, to places, to rituals that refuse to die. The Merovingians became less a political force and more a presence, a rumor folded into landscapes and symbols. And as with all suppressed stories, the echoes grew stranger the further they were buried. One of the strangest is the matter of the missing tomb. Nearly every king of France lies in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, a necropolis that is half cathedral, half reliquary of monarchy. The tombs stand in solemn rows, their inscriptions carved in marble, their crowns long since oxidized but still preserved as artifacts of rule. Yet Dagobert II is absent. His grandfather, Dagobert I, lies there in splendor, but the murdered king is nowhere to be found. Instead, accounts suggest his body was laid in a church in Stenay, far from the royal necropolis, where a small cult once venerated him as a martyr. Pilgrims visited, miracles were claimed, and his feast day was marked. Then, quietly, the veneration was discouraged. The cult was dissolved without fanfare. By the 12th century, Dagobert's memory had been brushed aside like dust on a stone floor. Why would the Church erase a sainted king unless his memory carried something unbearable? The suppression of saints is not common. To revoke veneration is to admit that sanctity itself can be inconvenient. And here again, the suspicion arises. that Dagobert was not simply a monarch who fell, but a king whose very blood was troubling. If he represented a line that claimed descent from Christ, then to honor him would be to legitimize a theology the Church could not allow. Better to move his tomb to obscurity, to scatter the pilgrims, and to pretend his cult never existed. Yet legends persisted in Stine, of dreams in which villagers saw a tall man in blue robes walking through the chapel, of visions of a silent queen and a boy holding a golden orb. They are fragments of folklore, yes, but they carry the residue of something more, memory that refused to vanish. From tombs we move to symbols, because symbols are harder to erase than names. The Merovingians had their sacred emblems, and the most striking was the bee. Archaeologists who opened the tomb of Childeric IV, father of Clovis, found over 300 golden bees buried with him, each exquisitely crafted, resting like guardians around his body. They were not decorative trinkets, but messages in metal, declarations that this was no ordinary king. Bees in ancient symbolism represented resurrection and eternal life, tiny winged souls that moved between worlds. To bury a king with them was to claim his rule extended beyond death. These bees disappeared from heraldry after the Merovingians were erased, but centuries later Napoleon revived them, embroidering them into his robes, etching them into his imperial seals, declaring them symbols of industriousness. Yet to those who remembered, it was more than industry. It was inheritance. Why would Napoleon, desperate to clothe himself in legitimacy, reach back not to the Carolingians or the Capetians, but to the long-forgotten Merovingians? Perhaps because their symbols carried a charge older than papal blessing, something primal that whispered of sacred kingship. Another emblem tied to them is the fleur-de-lis, later adopted by French monarchy, but said to have originated with Merovingian use. To most, it became a simple royal insignia, a stylized lily. But lilies, like bees, carried deeper resonance, purity, immortality, divine selection. The fleur-de-lis was not only a heraldic flourish, it was a continuation of sacred iconography. When you find bees, lilies, and long hair together, you glimpse a symbolic language that claimed kingship not as political accident, but as spiritual destiny. It is this language that Rome sought to mute, because symbols linger long after kings are gone, and symbols can revive what chronicles erase. The erasure itself was not only symbolic, but textual. Chroniclers under Carolingian patronage revised history, painting Merovingian kings as indolent, weak, or corrupt. The once celebrated Rex Crinitus, the long-haired king, became a caricature, a ruler who did nothing while his mayors controlled everything. This image suited the new dynasty, justifying their takeover as necessary reform. Yet earlier sources had praised Merovingians for vision and miracle. The shift is too sharp to ignore. It is not the evolution of opinion, but the rewriting of narrative. And when narratives are rewritten, one must ask, what was so urgent to hide? Some clues may lie in the rise of alternative Christianities that flourished in southern France centuries later. The Cathars, condemned as heretics, preached a vision of Christianity that emphasized spiritual purity and rejected the authority of Rome. They, too, were brutally suppressed in the Albigensian Crusade, their documents seized, their villages burned. Among the texts taken at Montségur in 1244 were said to be genealogical charts and apocryphal gospels, some referring cryptically to a linea sacra regalis, the sacred royal line. These documents vanished into the Vatican's vaults, never to be seen again. Did they preserve echoes of the same bloodline the Merovingians had claimed? We cannot know, but the convergence of legends in the same region, the Languedoc, is striking. Mary Magdalene was said to have landed here by boat after the crucifixion, bringing her child with her. Sigisbert IV was said to have been hidden here after his father's murder, and the Cathars, centuries later, guarded documents hinting at a sacred line. Patterns like this, though speculative, do not form easily by accident. The Vatican's archives themselves are part of the mystery. Few places on earth hold so many sealed documents, manuscripts hidden from public view. Scholars whisper of texts redacted, of gospels buried, of records that could not be allowed to disturb dogma. Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century Jesuit polymath, once mentioned a manuscript in the Vatican written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, sealed in a copper box, which he called sanguis veritatis, the blood of truth. He said it undermined the foundations of doctrine with lineage too ancient to dispute. He never referred to it again. Was it metaphor, exaggeration, or a glimpse of something real? The answer remains locked behind Vatican doors. But when we combine this with the missing tomb, the suppressed saint, the erased chronicles, and the persistent symbols, the shape of a deliberate concealment begins to emerge. What makes this story compelling is not proof, but pattern. Proof is brittle. Patterns endure. The Merovingians may have been folded out of history, but their traces remain scattered across Europe like glowing embers. A tomb misplaced, a symbol revived, a gospel silenced, a cult erased. Each by itself is anomaly, but together they suggest intention. To walk among these fragments is to feel the tension between the official narrative and the whispers it cannot quite extinguish. Part 4, then, leaves us at the threshold of a paradox. The Merovingians were both erased and preserved, erased from chronicles, preserved in rumor, erased from Saint-Denis, preserved in Stenay, erased from heraldry, preserved in Napoleon's bees. Suppression, after all, is never total. It only drives memory into stranger shapes, into dreams and symbols, into silences that speak louder than words. And in those silences, the story of a bloodline, real or imagined, continues to breathe, waiting for someone to listen. To move further into this labyrinth of silence is to confront the figures who supposedly became its keepers, the secret guardians, the watchers in shadows, the ones who carried forward what could not be spoken in chronicles. If the Merovingian bloodline survived Dagobert II's assassination and Sigisbert's disappearance, it could not have endured on its own. It would have needed protection, secrecy, and perhaps even invention to cloak itself from hostile powers. And here, the story turns toward one of the most controversial societies ever whispered about, the Priory of Sion. The Priory of Sion entered modern awareness in the mid-20th century when a set of peculiar papers, the so-called dossiers secrets, appeared in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France. On the surface, they were a mixture of genealogical charts, letters, and lists of supposed grand masters of a secret society. To skeptics, they looked like elaborate fantasy, an eccentric hoax stitched together by Pierre Plantard, a man with a taste for esoteric conspiracies. Yet even skeptics admitted that the papers contained details so obscure, so oddly accurate, that their origin could not be dismissed outright. They mentioned tombs whose layouts matched reality, heraldic devices that fit medieval traditions, and family trees that traced through obscure nobles of the Languedoc, people no ordinary forger would have known. According to the dossiers, the Priory of Sion was an ancient brotherhood charged with protecting a secret bloodline, the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, carried through the Merovingians. They claimed that Sigisbert IV escaped assassination and lived under protection in the south of France, founding a hidden dynasty that continued quietly into modern times. The priory's mission was not to seize power, but to preserve the lineage, to ensure its survival until the world could understand it. The names of their grand masters, as listed in the papers, read like a roll call of brilliance: Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo. To most historians, this is laughable, evidence of hoax, but others see it as deliberate camouflage. If you scatter a few absurdities among your truths, you make the whole thing easier to dismiss while still planting seeds for those who look closely. The question that hangs in the air is whether the Priory of Sion ever existed at all. Plantard eventually admitted to fabricating some of the documents, yet his admission does not erase the troubling precision of certain details. Forgeries rarely contain truths so specific. And even if the priory was modern invention, it tapped into an older current, a set of whispers that had long circulated in the hills of the Languedoc and the cathedrals of Paris. Sometimes the creation of a myth is itself a way of guarding a secret, allowing it to survive in disguise. The Templars are often drawn into this thread. Founded in 1119 as protectors of pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Knights Templar quickly became one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Their wealth, their castles, their rituals, all radiated mystery. For nearly a century, they occupied the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and according to legend, they spent much of their time digging beneath it. What were they searching for? Some say relics, others scrolls, and still others, the proof of a sacred bloodline. When they returned to Europe, they were transformed. Richer, more secretive, steeped in symbols that seemed to blend geometry, astronomy, and mysticism. Their downfall in 1307, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, is still shrouded in suspicion. Tortured confessions spoke of heads, idols, strange rites. Skeptics see these as inventions under duress, but others wonder whether the Templars had indeed stumbled upon something too dangerous to reveal. Perhaps they had found records of the bloodline, perhaps they had guarded it, or perhaps they had sought to control it themselves. The theory that links the Priory of Sion, the Templars, and the Merovingians is not one of proof, but of continuity. Legends recur in the same places, symbols repeat, and gaps in the record align with whispers that never seem to die. Rennes-le-Château, a small village in southern France, became in the 19th century a focal point of this narrative. Its priest, Béranger Saunière, transformed from a poor curate into a man of sudden wealth after renovations of his church. The church itself, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, soon bristled with bizarre imagery. Demons, cryptic inscriptions, and an architecture that seemed to encode riddles. Saunière built a tower, filled it with books, hosted strange guests, and died with secrets he never revealed. His servant, on her deathbed, is said to have whispered that The secret is so big, people would never believe it. To skeptics, this is coincidence and exaggeration. To believers, it is another signpost pointing to the survival of a truth long buried: the bloodline. It is tempting to dismiss all of this as elaborate fantasy, the kind of pattern-making that human minds cannot resist. Yet the persistence of the theme, hidden heirs, suppressed chronicles, secret guardians, suggests that something lies beneath. History does not erase dynasties so completely without cause. And the more one looks, the more one notices how carefully the Merovingians were not condemned but silenced. Their cults were dissolved, their saints forgotten, their symbols co-opted, their tombs misplaced. This is not the treatment of kings who failed. It is the treatment of kings who carried something too dangerous to remember. In the 20th century, when books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail brought these theories into popular imagination, scholars rushed to refute them. Yet refutation often relied not on counter-evidence, but on dismissal, on the absence of proof. Absence is not nothing. Sometimes it is the strongest clue of all, and so even today the idea persists that a sacred bloodline survived, that it wound its way through centuries of secrecy, perhaps hidden in noble families, perhaps shielded by societies like the Priory of Sion. If this is true, it would mean that the greatest treasure of Christendom is not a relic in a reliquary, but people walking quietly among us. Part 5, then, lingers on this unsettling thought. Whether or not the Priory of Sion ever existed, whether or not the Templars truly guarded scrolls from beneath the temple, the idea itself has shaped history. Myths can move armies, symbols can topple dynasties, and whispers can outlast the silence of official records. The Merovingian story may be more than history. It may be the skeleton key to centuries of rumor, conspiracy, and secret longing. Because at its heart lies a question too potent to extinguish. What if divinity walked not only in spirit, but in blood? And what if that blood still flows in veins today? To move further into the shadows of this story is to enter a landscape where history, legend, and architecture intertwine like roots of an old tree that refuses to die. If the Merovingian bloodline survived in secrecy, it would need not only guardians, but places, stone and soil that could harbor memory when chronicles erased it. Southern France, particularly the region of Languedoc, is filled with such places. Its hills are dotted with ruined castles, its churches whisper with strange inscriptions, its villages preserve odd stories and folk songs and stained glass. For centuries, this region has been a cradle of heterodoxy, a landscape where official doctrine always seemed to unravel into something older, more elusive, more dangerous. Mary Magdalene is central to this geography of memory. Legends say she fled the Holy Land after the crucifixion, traveling by boat across the Mediterranean, landing at the shores of Provence. In these stories, she did not come alone. Some tales say she brought her brother Lazarus and her sister Martha. Others whisper of a child, a daughter named Sarah, dark-haired and veiled, who grew into the ancestress of a hidden line. Even today, the Romani people of the Camargue honor Sarah la Cali, a mysterious black saint who some connect to this legend. In the crypt of Sainte Marie de la Mer, pilgrims leave offerings for her, candles flickering in the dim stone chamber as though to keep alive a secret that cannot be spoken aloud. Whether Sarah was real or symbolic, her presence in tradition points to the idea that Mary Magdalene carried more than grief to France. she carried continuity. The Languedoc later became home to the Cathars, a Christian sect that rejected the authority of Rome and emphasized purity of spirit over institutional power. They believed in a dualistic universe, light and darkness locked in struggle, and they lived with an austerity that both fascinated and terrified their contemporaries. The Church branded them heretics, and in the 13th century launched the Albigensian Crusade to eradicate them. Entire towns were massacred, libraries burned, and documents lost. Yet among the fragments that survived are hints of genealogical records, scrolls smuggled out of Montségur, and cryptic references to a linea regalis, a royal line. Were the Cathars simply another heresy? Or were they inheritors of whispers about the Merovingians, protectors of manuscripts too dangerous to see daylight? The possibility lingers like smoke over their ruined fortresses. One of the strangest nodes in this geography of secrecy is Rennes-le-Château, a hilltop village that became infamous in the 19th century. Its priest, Béranger Saunière, was poor until he began renovations on his crumbling church. Then, suddenly, he was rich. He built a library tower, filled his church with bizarre imagery, and left behind coded inscriptions that still puzzle researchers today. The church was dedicated to Mary Magdalene, and in its shadows one finds carvings of demons, cryptic Latin phrases, and a statue of her holding a skull as though guarding something eternal. Saunière died without explaining the source of his wealth. His housekeeper later confessed on her deathbed that the priest had discovered a secret so great, so extraordinary, that no one would ever believe it. To skeptics, this is colorful rumor. To believers, it is another signpost in a chain that leads back to the idea of a bloodline protected in silence. Architecture itself becomes a form of testimony. Gothic cathedrals, rising like frozen music across France, are filled with imagery that does not always align neatly with official doctrine. In Chartres Cathedral, stained glass windows depict the Virgin Mary enthroned, but some panels emphasize Magdalene with unusual prominence. At Notre-Dame de Paris, gargoyles and grotesques leer from the stone, as if mocking the purity of official religion. Symbols of bees, stars, and lilies appear woven into the stonework of forgotten chapels, reminders that sacred geometry was as much about secrecy as beauty. Builders of these monuments were often connected to guilds that preserved esoteric knowledge. Some say that through geometry and symbol, they left coded messages pointing to truths too dangerous to write outright. When we view these places not as isolated curiosities, but as part of a pattern, they begin to cohere into a map of silence. Southern France becomes a palimpsest of suppressed memory. Magdalene's arrival, Cathar strongholds, Saunière's church, hidden manuscripts, and whispered genealogies. The Vatican's reaction to this region is telling. The Albigensian Crusade was one of the most brutal campaigns ever launched against Christians by Christians. Why such ferocity against a sect that, by all accounts, lived in poverty and simplicity? Perhaps because the Cathars preserved something Rome could not tolerate. Not only a rival theology, but fragments of a rival history, one that connected back to a bloodline the Church needed to erase. And yet, paradoxically, the suppression only amplified the whispers. Tourists flock to Rennes-le-Château today, searching for Saunière's treasure. Pilgrims honor Sarah-la-Caille in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. Writers trace the lineage of the Merovingians through noble families of the Languedoc. Even Dan Brown, in his novelistic interpretation, drew on this landscape of secrecy. Fiction and history blur, yet the blur itself is telling. When a story refuses to die, when it survives massacre, crusade, ridicule, and time, it often suggests that the soil beneath it still hides something. The danger, of course, is mistaking resonance for proof. There is no surviving gospel that plainly declares Jesus had children. No genealogical record has been authenticated beyond doubt. Yet history is not only about what survives in ink, it is also about what persists in ritual, in symbol, in rumor. The persistence of Magdalene in southern France, the persistence of Cathar myths, the persistence of Saunier's secret, all form a pattern that points towards something that mattered enough to suppress. Part 6, then, rests in that tension. Perhaps it was all coincidence, a convergence of folklore and human imagination. Or perhaps it was not. Perhaps beneath the hills of Languedoc, in crypts sealed and archives locked, lies the residue of a truth that would shatter the foundations of Christendom. That the Holy Grail was not a chalice, but a womb. Not a relic, but a lineage. Not an object, but blood still flowing in human veins. The silence around it does not disprove it. If anything, the silence deepens the suspicion, like a locked door in a house that otherwise stands open. And when you stand in those hills, looking at ruined fortresses against a sky streaked with crimson at dusk, you cannot help but wonder whether the wind itself carries fragments of the story the world was never meant to hear. As the centuries unfolded, the legend of the hidden bloodline did not disappear, but rather adapted, absorbing new forms, finding new guardians, and resurfacing in unexpected places. What began as a dynastic story about the Merovingians slowly transformed into a broader myth about the Holy Grail, about sacred blood concealed in plain sight. The medieval imagination, with its love of quests and riddles, gave this story new life. Knights rode not only to Jerusalem, but also into allegories, and the Grail became the most enigmatic symbol in Western literature, elusive, luminous, and always connected to the question of worthiness. Yet behind the poetry lies a possibility that the Grail was never meant to be a chalice of gold, but something alive, something carried forward in flesh and blood. The earliest Grail romances, like those of Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, speak of a mysterious vessel carried by a maiden in a solemn procession, glowing with light. Later versions, such as those by Wolfram von Eschenbach, add layers of mysticism, making the Grail not a cup, but a stone, a heavenly gift guarded by Templars. Each retelling bends the Grail into new shapes, but one thread persists. It is always about transmission, about who is worthy to approach, who may inherit, who may hold it. When we look through this lens, the Grail is less an artifact and more a metaphor for lineage. The vessel is a family, a bloodline, carrying something divine forward through generations. The connection between Grail romance and the Merovingians might at first seem tenuous, but the geography overlaps. Many of the earliest Grail stories emerged in the very regions of southern France, where legends of Magdalene's arrival and Sigisbert's survival persisted. The troubadours who sang of love and loss also sang of hidden treasure and secret descent. Courtly patrons in Languedoc and Aquitaine sponsored tales of mystical quests, embedding their own landscapes into myth. Castles in the Pyrenees and chapels near the Rhone became the backdrops of Grail literature, suggesting that the myths were not born of imagination alone, but out of local traditions already steeped in whispers of sacred continuity. The Templars loom large in these stories. Eschenbach describes the Grail as guarded by a brotherhood of knights dwelling in a fortress, a detail that eerily mirrors the real-life Templars, who were rumored to have secret knowledge from their time in Jerusalem. When Philip IV of France moved to destroy them, the charges of heresy included strange rituals and hidden relics. One legend claims that at Montségur, a Cathar stronghold and alleged Grail site, a small group of knights escaped with a mysterious treasure on the eve of its fall. Was this treasure manuscripts, gold, or something far more subversive? A genealogy? The details remain shrouded, but the alignment of Templar legends with Grail tales strengthens the suspicion that the myth encoded more than spiritual allegory. Mary Magdalene's role in this shift is crucial. In canonical texts, she is witness to resurrection, apostle to the apostles. But in apocryphal writings like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, she is portrayed as Christ's intimate companion, even rivaling Peter in spiritual authority. These texts, buried for centuries and only rediscovered in modern times, align with the legend that she carried more than memory to France. In art, her image shifted from penitent prostitute to bearer of secrets, often depicted holding a jar or a vessel. Was this vessel meant to symbolize oil, memory, or womb? The ambiguity allowed layers of meaning, and for those seeking the Grail, Magdalene herself became the Grail, the vessel of divine blood. If Magdalene was the Grail, then the Merovingians, claiming descent through her, were the keepers of it. Their long hair, their visions, their bees and lilies were not just cultural quirks, but signs of something sacred in their blood. To the Church, this interpretation was heresy. To the poets, it was inspiration. The Grail quest, then, was not about knights searching for a cup, but about seekers trying to trace a hidden lineage, to find those who carried a fragment of divinity in their veins. The worthiness they sought was not in strength of arms, but in purity of descent, or in the capacity to recognize and protect it. The silence of the Vatican around Magdalene deepens the mystery. Why was she, out of all disciples, recast in Western tradition as a repentant prostitute? The Gospels never name her as such, but Gregory the Great in the 6th century merged her with other figures, branding her with shame. This act not only diminished her authority, but obscured her role as potential partner and heir. To smear Magdalene was to sever the link between Christ and any suggestion of family. It was to bury the idea of continuity in scandal. And yet, across Europe, local traditions continued to venerate her as saint, patron, and bringer of secrets. Symbols once more weave into the story. The chalice, the lily, the bee, the rose, all appear in Grail romances and Merovingian lore alike. The rose in particular becomes emblematic, later associated with the Rosicrucians, another secret brotherhood that claimed hidden wisdom passed through centuries. Rosicrucian manifestos in the 17th century spoke of knowledge kept from the profane and of inheritors of divine mysteries. Whether these manifestos were literal or symbolic, they point again to the persistence of a tradition that refuses to die, reshaping itself in each new era. The power of myth lies not in its proof, but in its endurance. The Grail legend endured because it spoke to longing, to the suspicion that the divine was not locked in heaven, but woven into humanity itself. If the Merovingian bloodline carried that thread, then the Grail was no object to be locked away but a living secret, dangerous precisely because it blurred the boundary between God and man. No church could control such a truth. No institution could sanction it. It had to be buried, disguised, and coded into stories of knights and quests, so that only those with eyes to see could glimpse the secret beneath the fiction. Part 7, then, leaves us standing at the crossroads of literature and conspiracy. Were the Grail stories mere allegories of Christian virtue, or were they veiled histories of a suppressed lineage? Were troubadours simply spinning fantasies, or were they cloaking whispers of Magdalene and Sigisbert in song? The silence of history will not answer. But in the persistence of these tales, in the way they pulse through centuries of art, poetry, and secret societies, we hear again the faint echo of the bloodline, hidden yet unforgotten, alive in legend if not in flesh. To move deeper into this woven web of secrecy, we must turn to the question of guardianship. Not just whispered societies like the Priory of Sion, nor grand orders like the Templars, but the way in which families, symbols, and places themselves seemed to act as vessels of continuity. If a bloodline was truly carried forward, it would not survive through centuries of persecution and silence without allies. These allies might not have thought of themselves as conspirators, but rather as stewards of something fragile, something dangerous to reveal too openly, yet too precious to allow to vanish. In southern France, noble families carried surnames that appeared again and again in local legends connected with the Merovingians. Names like Blanchefort, Hautpoul, and Plantard surfaced in genealogies and inscriptions, their lines intertwined with stories of Saunier's secret at Rennes-le-Château. Some of these families lived in quiet obscurity, others held regional influence, but together they formed a lattice of memory. Oral histories in these households spoke of ancestors connected to the line, though rarely was it spoken directly. Instead, it was cloaked in phrases like sang réel, real blood, or in the careful preservation of symbols carved into coats of arms. One symbol that recurs is the five-pointed star. On the face of it, it is simply a geometric form, used widely in Christian and pre-Christian contexts. But in the region of Languedoc, it appears carved into keystones of chapels, engraved on tombs, and painted into manuscripts. To the Cathars, it represented perfection and the balance of spirit. To later esoteric groups, it was the pentagram, sign of hidden knowledge. But among families connected to the Merovingian story, the star came to be associated with lineage itself, pointing to a birthright hidden among constellations. The connection between heaven and genealogy, between stars and blood, is a theme that surfaces repeatedly in folklore. Another guardian of memory was architecture. The churches of the Languedoc often hold anomalies in their decoration. Carvings of Magdalene in places where she should not be, inscriptions referencing obscure saints, frescoes showing strange genealogical trees. In one chapel, a tree of Jesse, usually a depiction of Christ's ancestry, was painted with branches that seemed to extend not toward Bethlehem, but toward local villages, as if hinting that sacred descent had taken root in French soil. Whether these were acts of rebellion, eccentric art, or deliberate encoding, the effect was the same. to preserve in stone what could not be written in parchment. Guardianship also came through ritual. The Romany pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer each May, in honor of Sarah la Kali, is a striking example. Sarah's identity is ambiguous. Some call her a servant of the Marys, others a saint in her own right. But in Romani devotion, she is the Black Queen, protector and mother, a figure of inheritance. Candles flicker before her statue, and worshippers lift her above the crowd, carrying her into the sea as if reenacting her arrival. For those who connect Sarah to Magdalene's supposed daughter, the ritual becomes more than devotion. It becomes a reenactment of survival, a yearly remembrance of sacred blood arriving by boat, carried into exile, yet never extinguished. The secrecy of such traditions may be less about conspiracy and more about survival. In a world where Rome's authority demanded uniformity, difference had to go underground. To speak too openly was to risk heresy charges, inquisitorial trials, or crusades like the one that eradicated the Cathars. So symbols, rituals, and genealogies went subterranean, living in allegory, legend, and local practice. The guardians did not have to be knights in shining armor or members of elite societies. They could be villagers tending shrines, stonemasons etching flowers into capitals, families passing down stories by firelight. And yet, alongside these quiet guardians, there were also louder claimants, figures and societies who stepped forward, centuries later, to declare themselves heirs of the secret. The Rosicrucians in the 17th century proclaimed themselves keepers of ancient wisdom, their manifestos filled with language about inheritance, mystery, and divine descent. In the 18th century, Freemasonry expanded across Europe, cloaking rituals in geometry and allegory, with references to Solomon's Temple, the Sacred Ark, and lost secrets of blood and stone. Whether these groups truly preserved fragments of the Merovingian story or merely reinvented it is impossible to say. But their symbols often overlapped: roses, crosses, stars, and chalices, all of which echo Grail imagery and the language of hidden lineage. The most curious development came in the 19th century, when a man named Pierre Plantard began weaving together the modern image of the Priory of Sion. He presented genealogies tracing his family back to Dagobert II and Sigisbert IV, claimed connections to noble houses of Languedoc, and positioned himself as a steward of the sacred line. Many historians dismiss him as a fraud, but his work was built upon local traditions that long predated him. Even if he exaggerated, he was pulling on threads that were already woven into the cultural fabric of the region. Plantard may not have invented the story, but he gave it modern form, ensuring it would re-enter public imagination in the 20th century. The guardianship of the bloodline, then, may not be a single conspiracy, but a mosaic of efforts, conscious and unconscious. Families, villages, rituals, societies, all acted as vessels, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. The persistence of certain symbols, bees, lilies, stars, roses, suggests a continuity that outlived dynasties, and through it all, the central theme remained: that divinity might not have ascended wholly to heaven, but lingered in humanity, carried in blood, preserved in silence. This guardianship also shaped resistance. When the Cathars were massacred, their last fortress at Montségur was besieged for months. On the night before its fall in 1244, legends say 4 Cathars slipped away with a hidden treasure. Some imagine it was gold, others manuscripts, others the Grail itself. The treasure was never found, but the story of their escape became another fragment of guardianship, a suggestion that even when fire consumed their fortress, they ensured continuity. If the treasure was a bloodline, then those four were not simply couriers but keepers of humanity's most explosive inheritance. Part 8 closes with this thought. Guardianship is not always grand or obvious. It may live in secret societies, but it also lives in folk rituals, in carved stars on forgotten chapels, in whispered genealogies passed through centuries. The guardians were not only knights and nobles, but ordinary people who preserved fragments of a story too dangerous for official history. And because of them, the whisper of the bloodline survives. If the Merovingians were truly heirs to something sacred, their survival is owed not only to royal will, but to countless anonymous stewards who refused to let silence become extinction. In this, the story of the bloodline is also a story of human persistence, of memory finding ways to live even when power commands it to die. The longer one lingers among these fragments, the more one realizes that the story of the supposed sacred bloodline is not confined to dusty chronicles or obscure chapels in southern France. It stretches outward, entangling itself with the great shifts of European history, shaping not only myths, but politics, art, and even the very idea of kingship. If the Merovingians were erased as rulers, their shadow remained as a challenge to every dynasty that followed. For what could be more threatening to monarchs and popes alike than the rumor that a lineage of divine right still existed, hidden yet alive, waiting for the right moment to reappear? When the Carolingians replaced the Merovingians, they did so with the explicit blessing of the papacy. Pepin the Short sought legitimacy from Rome, and in exchange offered loyalty. Charlemagne, his son, would later be crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself, reviving the imperial title in the West. This coronation was not simply ceremony, it was an act of rewriting the very foundations of power. With one gesture, papal authority became the fountain of kingship, not blood or myth. In a sense, Charlemagne's entire reign was an attempt to overwrite the memory of the Merovingians. His laws, his alliances with the Church, his sponsorship of learning, all radiated a message. Legitimacy now flows through Rome, not through ancient, semi-divine dynasties. But suppression never works cleanly. Among Charlemagne's descendants, and among the Capetians who later ruled France, rumors of Merovingian descent continued to swirl. Even when not publicly acknowledged, whispers circulated that noble families in Aquitaine and Burgundy traced their lines back to Sigisbert IV. This undercurrent of suspicion haunted French history, surfacing especially during times of crisis when legitimacy was contested. If a reigning monarch's right could be questioned, someone inevitably raised the possibility that the true heirs were still out there, hidden in plain sight. The Renaissance amplified these whispers. With the revival of classical learning and the rediscovery of suppressed texts, Europe once again became fertile ground for legends. Leonardo da Vinci, later named as a supposed Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, filled his notebooks with cryptic drawings, anatomical sketches, and coded inventions. Some interpret his paintings, especially The Last Supper, as containing secret allusions to Magdalene seated beside Christ. Whether this is artistic interpretation or deliberate encoding, the association persists because it resonates with the idea of a suppressed truth resurfacing in art. The Renaissance was an age obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and hidden knowledge, and so the myth of the bloodline found fertile soil to take root once more. During the Reformation, when Protestant voices challenged the authority of Rome, rumors of hidden gospels and alternative Christianities re-emerged. Some reformers accused the Catholic Church of burying not only the truth of Scripture, but also genealogies that would prove its corruption. Apocryphal writings, like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, suddenly seemed less like curiosities and more like evidence that the Church had silenced vital pieces of history. Though the reformers themselves did not openly embrace the bloodline theory, their critiques opened the door wider for alternative narratives. Once people learned that sacred texts could be suppressed, it was not a great leap to imagine that entire dynasties could be erased as well. The Enlightenment, ironically, also gave fuel to the legend. In an age that prized reason and skepticism, secret societies flourished. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Illuminists. They thrived on allegory, ritual, and the idea of hidden truths guarded for the worthy. Within their lodges, symbols like the rose, the chalice, the star, and the bee reappeared, detached from their original Merovingian context, but carrying the same aura of secrecy. Some Masonic rites included references to ancient kings who had been betrayed, hidden heirs who would return, or a lost lineage that needed restoration. To the rational world outside, these were metaphors, but to initiates, they hinted at continuity with a mystery too old to extinguish. By the time the 19th century arrived, Europe was restless with revolution and empire. Napoleon, as we have seen, deliberately revived Merovingian symbols, adorning himself with golden bees and presenting himself as heir to an ancient, primal authority. He knew that legitimacy was never just about law. It was about myth, about convincing the people that he was chosen not only by politics, but by destiny. His choice of the bee was not accidental. He could have chosen Roman eagles or Carolingian fleur-de-lis, but instead he reached back to the Merovingians, whose memory was almost extinguished, and clothed himself in their aura. That act alone kept the whisper alive. If Napoleon saw power in the Merovingians, perhaps there was more to their legacy than forgotten tombs. The 20th century brought the story into the modern imagination through works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which synthesized the fragments, Merovingians, Magdalene, Templars, Priory of Sion, into a coherent, if speculative, narrative. Critics tore it apart for lack of proof, but the book achieved something the Guardians themselves could never have done. It made the bloodline part of global consciousness. From that point on, the story no longer belonged only to historians or villagers in Languedoc. It became part of popular culture, absorbed into novels, films, and debates about the nature of faith and history. When millions of people ask the same forbidden question, what if Jesus had children? Then the silence of centuries cracks open just a little wider. But the story's power lies not in evidence, but in the way it unsettles. If true, it would overturn centuries of religious authority. If false, it still reveals something profound about human longing. The desire to connect heaven and earth, to see divinity not only in distant skies, but in the veins of human beings. The Merovingians, real or imagined, embody that longing, their long hair, their bees, Their legends of vision and miracle all point to a kingship rooted not in papal blessing, but in the sacredness of life itself. That idea is too radical to accept, yet too alluring to forget. Part 9 leaves us with the recognition that the myth has survived, not because it is proven, but because it cannot be disproven. It persists in art, in ritual, in the careful choice of symbols by emperors and secret societies alike. It persists in the silence of the Vatican, in the missing tomb of Dagobert, in the rituals at Sainte Marie de la Mer, and in the ruins of Montségur. Whether one believes or not, the story endures because it asks a question no one has ever been able to answer. What if the most sacred inheritance in history was never a doctrine or a relic, but a bloodline still moving quietly among us? To move into the next layer of this strange tapestry is to consider how the legend of the sacred bloodline seeped beyond the boundaries of religion and dynastic politics into the very fabric of culture. For myths, when they refuse to die, begin to disguise themselves in other forms, in art, in ritual, in the unconscious of a civilization. And nowhere is this more visible than in the way Europe's cultural memory has repeatedly circled back to the image of Magdalene, the Grail, and the lost heirs of Christ, not as rigid dogma, but as recurring archetypes, shadows that refuse to fade. The Renaissance was an age of rebirth, but it was also an age of disguise. While painters, architects, and poets celebrated the rediscovery of antiquity, they also encoded new questions into their works. Take Leonardo da Vinci, whose name has become almost synonymous with esoteric secrets. His Last Supper is perhaps the most dissected painting in the world, with viewers searching for a hidden Magdalene beside Christ, a missing chalice, or an encoded geometry pointing to suppressed truths. Whether Leonardo deliberately painted Magdalene in the place where tradition assumes the Apostle John, or whether it is modern imagination that sees her there, the controversy itself testifies to a hunger for hidden meaning. Leonardo's notebooks, filled with backward writing, alchemical symbols, and strange anatomical drawings, have long been read as the work of a man who guarded truths too dangerous to reveal directly. And so, he became an ideal candidate for inclusion on the Priory of Sion's list of Grand Masters, whether true or fabricated. But Leonardo was not alone. Renaissance art is saturated with Magdalene imagery, often depicting her not as penitent sinner, but as visionary, radiant with knowledge, clutching a jar that looks less like perfume and more like a vessel. In Florence, Caravaggio painted her weeping with passion and intensity that suggests not guilt, but grief for a lover. In Northern Europe, artists gave her hair the radiant length once associated with Merovingian kings, a subtle echo of the same sacred power. These depictions, multiplying across the centuries, shaped the subconscious of Europe. Magdalene as bearer of something unspoken, the Grail incarnate. Literature carried the theme as well. Dante in the Divine Comedy alludes cryptically to the vessel of truth, hidden from the unworthy. Later poets spoke of roses that concealed secrets, of stars guiding heirs, of kings betrayed but destined to return. Even Shakespeare, in his histories, returns to the motif of lost heirs and bloodlines concealed in exile, as though dramatizing in fictional kings the same anxiety that haunted real monarchs. That legitimacy could be hidden, waiting to reassert itself at the right moment. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe's fascination with the esoteric had reached fever pitch. The Romantic movement, with its obsession with mystery, ruin, and lost worlds, reawakened the Grail theme in new forms. Poets like Novalis and Byron invoked the Grail as symbol of unattainable longing, while Wagner's Parsifal turned the legend into opera, its soaring music and solemn staging reviving the medieval dream of a sacred vessel that conferred destiny. Yet beneath the romance lurked the same dangerous idea, that sacredness was not locked in relics or institutions, but in something alive, something that could be inherited. Wagner's Grail was both a stone and a mystery of blood, echoing Wolfram von Eschenbach's earlier suggestion that the Grail wasn't a chalice, but a living gift guarded by knights. The 19th century also witnessed the rediscovery of Rennes-le-Château, with Béranger Saunière's wealth and secrets feeding a new wave of speculation. Writers began to connect the dots between Saunière's cryptic renovations, Magdalene's legends in southern France, and the Merovingian line. The idea that a priest had stumbled upon documents proving the survival of the bloodline electrified imaginations. Even though no treasure was ever definitively found, the story persisted because it fit seamlessly into the existing pattern: guardianship, secrecy, wealth unexplained, and silence enforced. It was in this century that secret societies flourished most openly, their rituals filled with symbolism that echoed the bloodline legend whether consciously or not. The Freemasons, with their emphasis on hidden knowledge and lineage of wisdom, seemed to embody the very idea of guardianship. Rosicrucians claimed to preserve ancient truths passed down through mysterious initiates. Even occultists like Eliphas Levi spoke of a current flowing through history, a hidden stream of power that linked biblical patriarchs, Egyptian magi, and European dynasties. Whether or not they were speaking of the Merovingians directly, they contributed to the same atmosphere. The sense that something sacred was hidden, that truth was veiled, that blood and spirit were intertwined in ways official religion dared not acknowledge. By the 20th century, this atmosphere ripened into full-blown speculation. The publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1982 crystallized centuries of fragments into a single theory: that Jesus married Magdalene, that they had children, that their descendants became the Merovingians, and that their line survived to this day under the protection of secret guardians. The book combined archaeology, textual analysis, folklore, and conjecture into a narrative that was immediately controversial but irresistibly compelling. Critics accused the authors of selective reading, exaggeration, and invention. Yet readers devoured it, not because it offered proof, but because it spoke to a hunger left unsatisfied by orthodox history. From there, the legend seeped fully into popular culture. Novels, films, and television shows retold the bloodline story in countless variations. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code transformed it into global phenomenon, embedding the theory into the collective imagination of millions. Suddenly, tourists swarmed to Rennes-le-Château, pilgrims filled Magdalene's shrines, and the idea of a living lineage of Christ was no longer fringe but mainstream curiosity. Historians scoffed, the church condemned, but the story lived on, stronger than before, precisely because it resonated with the modern world's suspicion of authority and thirst for hidden truths. The persistence of this legend across so many forms — painting, poetry, opera, secret society, and pop fiction — suggests that it is more than conspiracy theory. It has become an archetype, a recurring image in the Western mind, that of sacred continuity hidden in blood. In psychology, Archetypes endure not because they are proven, but because they address deep human longings. The bloodline legend speaks to the longing for connection with the divine, not through priests or rituals, but through flesh and kinship, through the very human story of family. It is a radical inversion of orthodoxy, which insists that God is separate, that Christ was divine precisely because he transcended human inheritance. The bloodline says otherwise, that the divine was also human, that sanctity could run in veins, that salvation itself might be embodied in generations. Part 10, then, marks a shift in perspective. We are no longer only tracing lost kings or suspicious documents. We are seeing how the myth itself has evolved, shaping imagination and culture across centuries. Whether true or not, the story of the bloodline has achieved a kind of immortality. It survives not in archives, but in art, in ritual, in novels, in the restless dreams of Europe and beyond. And perhaps that is the most powerful proof of all, a secret that can never be disproved, that lives on not in evidence, but in the hunger of human beings to believe that heaven may have walked into earth and never fully left. The further we trace the legend, the more it begins to intersect with questions not just of faith or politics, but of identity itself. Because if there truly existed a sacred bloodline, if descendants of Christ and Magdalene walked among us, then the definition of humanity and divinity would blur in ways that no institution could comfortably manage. This is why the myth has proven so persistent. It is not only a story of hidden kings, but a story of what it means to be human, and what it might mean if the divine could live in ordinary veins. To explore this possibility is to enter the tension between orthodoxy and heresy, between what the Church allowed and what it feared. Orthodoxy insists that Christ was fully divine and fully human, yet separate from any lineage. His death and resurrection mark the end of his earthly life and the beginning of his eternal role as Savior. To grant him a wife, to imagine children, would make him less a solitary divine figure and more a founder of a family, a patriarch whose legacy continued biologically. Such an idea destabilizes the theological architecture of the Church, for if sanctity can be inherited, then authority no longer belongs to bishops or popes, but to the heirs themselves. This is why Magdalene's image was reshaped so dramatically in the 6th century, when Pope Gregory the Great fused her identity with that of a repentant prostitute. With a single sermon, her authority was erased, her voice diminished. She was no longer Christ's partner or companion. She was a sinner redeemed. That shift was not innocent. It was necessary to protect the idea of Christ as solitary Savior and to bury the possibility of continuity. Yet apocryphal texts whisper otherwise. The Gospel of Philip describes Magdalene as Christ's koinonos, a Greek word that carries the sense of intimate partner. The text also describes him kissing her often, a detail that scandalized early bishops. The Gospel of Mary portrays her as recipient of secret teachings, a leader whose authority was challenged by Peter, but defended by Christ himself. These texts were suppressed, branded heretical, and only rediscovered in the 20th century at Nag Hammadi. Their existence alone shows that alternative memories of Magdalene persisted in the earliest centuries of Christianity. If such voices were silenced in the 2nd century, then it is not impossible that genealogical traditions were silenced later as well. The Church's mechanisms of suppression were subtle as well as brutal. Councils defined canon, deciding which texts would be scripture and which would be apocrypha. Chronicles were rewritten to favor sanctioned dynasties. Saints were desecrated by omission, their cults dissolved quietly. In this atmosphere, anything that threatened the delicate structure of authority was buried under layers of silence. Yet silence does not erase. It leaves behind absences that hum with suspicion. Dagobert's missing tomb, the erased cult at Stenay, the Cathar manuscripts carried out of Montségur, all are examples of history bent not by accident, but by design. If Magdalene was recast as penitent prostitute, she was also preserved as patron saint. Her cult flourished in Provence, where pilgrims came to caves said to have sheltered her. In Vézelay, a magnificent basilica was built in her honor, its tympanum depicting her with unusual dignity. Even as the Vatican sought to diminish her, ordinary believers elevated her. They did not see a prostitute, they saw a saint. And in their devotion, traces of the older, more dangerous memory persisted. Magdalene as bearer of continuity, as vessel of inheritance. The paradox is telling. She was diminished in doctrine, but exalted in practice, erased in words, but preserved in stone. The concept of the Grail adds another layer. If Magdalene herself was the Grail, the vessel of blood, then all the quests, all the romances, all the coded allegories about knights seeking a cup become reinterpreted. They are not searching for a relic, but for a lineage, not for a chalice, but for a womb. The Grail is alive, moving through generations, hidden but never extinguished. This reframing explains why Grail romances are so obsessed with worthiness. The question is not who can hold a cup, but who can recognize and guard a bloodline. In this sense, the entire Arthurian cycle becomes a coded parable about guardianship, inheritance, and the hidden descendants of the sacred. Of course, skeptics point out that no evidence proves such a lineage. There are no authenticated genealogical records linking the Merovingians to Christ. But the absence of proof does not extinguish the story. In fact, it strengthens it, for absence itself feels intentional. If the Vatican holds archives inaccessible to all but a few, if manuscripts vanish into private collections, if tombs remain sealed, then absence becomes the strongest testimony of all. People sense the silence and interpret it as concealment, and concealment suggests that something worth hiding still lingers in the shadows. The psychological power of this story lies in its inversion of hierarchy. It says that the divine is not far away in heaven, but close at hand, pulsing in blood. It strips the church of its monopoly on salvation and hands it to flesh and family. That inversion is terrifying to institutions, but intoxicating to individuals. To imagine that Christ's children lived, married, had descendants, and walk among us is to imagine that divinity is closer than doctrine admits. It is to imagine that sacredness is not abstract, but embodied, not locked in ritual, but in veins. This idea has resonated in times of upheaval. In the Middle Ages, when famine and plague ravaged Europe, Grail romances flourished, offering hope that salvation was not lost but hidden. In the Reformation, when authority fractured, apocryphal texts and suppressed traditions resurfaced. In the Enlightenment, when reason challenged dogma, secret societies embraced the myth as allegory for hidden wisdom. And in the modern world, skeptical of institutions yet hungry for meaning, the bloodline theory has become a cultural phenomenon. It speaks to a universal desire, that we are not cut off from the divine, but connected to it through ancestry, through continuity, through the simplest and most human bond of all, family. Part 11 leaves us with a question that hovers like a candle flame in a dark cathedral. What if the story is not about kings or conspiracies at all, but about us? What if the bloodline, whether literal or metaphorical, is a reminder that the divine is not distant but within us, carried forward in ways we cannot always measure? Whether true in fact or true in symbol, the legend refuses to die because it speaks to something deeper than history. It speaks to hope, to identity, to the longing that heaven might live in human form, and that we might still carry fragments of it in our own blood. As the story unfolds into its later centuries, the legend of the sacred bloodline begins to intersect with politics in more direct and unsettling ways. For if the idea of a divine lineage survived, however quietly, then it posed not only a theological challenge to Rome, but a political challenge to kings. To rule by the blessing of the Church was one thing, but to rule in defiance of a bloodline believed to descend from Christ himself was another. This tension became most visible in France, where monarchs alternated between suppressing and appropriating the very symbols once linked to the Merovingians. And it is here that we see how myths can function as weapons, tools not just of belief, but of power. Take the fleur-de-lis, that stylized lily which became the emblem of French monarchy. Its earliest appearances are often attributed to Merovingian kings, who associated lilies with purity and divine selection. But after the Carolingians and Capetians displaced the Merovingians, the symbol was absorbed into their heraldry, severed from its original associations, and transformed into a mark of legitimacy for the new dynasty. This appropriation reveals something telling. Even as the Merovingians were erased, their symbols were too powerful to abandon. To use the fleur-de-lis was to claim continuity without admitting its origin. It was a subtle theft of legitimacy, a way of silencing the past while still feeding on its power. The same can be said of the bees discovered in Childric's tomb. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he revived the bee as his personal emblem, scattering golden bees across his robes and seals. He could have chosen Roman eagles or medieval lions, yet he reached back to the nearly forgotten Merovingians. Why? Because symbols hold memory even when chronicles are silent. The bee whispered of resurrection, continuity, eternal kingship. For an emperor desperate to root himself in destiny rather than mere conquest, the bee was perfect. But by reviving it, Napoleon also resurrected the ghost of the Merovingians themselves. He reminded the world, perhaps without intending to, that the first kings of France were not the Carolingians or Capetians, but the mysterious dynasty erased from the record. Throughout French history, moments of crisis often coincided with reappearances of the Merovingian shadow. During the Revolution, when the monarchy was toppled, whispers of hidden heirs circulated again. Pamphlets hinted at secret lines waiting to return, at forgotten claimants who could restore order. The bloodline became less about Christ and more about legitimacy itself, a way of challenging any ruler who claimed divine right. For if Christ's descendants truly lived, then all other monarchs were impostors. It was an idea that could destabilize not only France, but all of Europe. In England, too, the legend took on strange forms. Some genealogists claimed that the Stuart line, through intermarriage with French nobility, carried traces of Merovingian blood. Others argued that the Plantagenets inherited fragments of the sacred descent. Though these claims were often tenuous, they reveal how the myth expanded beyond France, becoming a European question rather than a regional curiosity. Monarchs and pretenders alike invoked ancient bloodlines to justify their place, whether or not the evidence supported them. In this way, the sacred lineage functioned less as history and more as currency, a form of symbolic capital that could be spent in moments of crisis. The Vatican's silence through all of this is striking. Officially, the Church dismissed the Merovingians as rois fainéants, do-nothing kings unworthy of remembrance, but the very ferocity of their dismissal suggests unease. To call them lazy was to trivialize them, to reduce their aura to nothing. Yet the persistence of local cults, shrines, and folk legends indicates that people did not so easily forget. The Church could silence texts, but it could not silence memory. And memory, passed quietly from generation to generation, is often more resilient than doctrine. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the legend had become ripe for reinterpretation. Occultists in Paris, mystics in London, and esoteric societies across Europe began to weave the Merovingians into broader tapestries of hidden history. Writers like Joséphin Péladan and Jules Douanel connected Magdalene, the Grail, and the sacred bloodline to their own mystical visions. In their hands, the Merovingians were no longer just forgotten kings, but symbols of humanity's potential to merge the divine and the earthly. Whether through ritual, art, or secret knowledge, they sought to restore what they believed had been deliberately suppressed: the union of heaven and earth through blood and memory. This reinterpretation reached its most famous expression in the late 20th century with books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Here, the threads of history, legend, and speculation were woven into a single narrative that electrified readers around the world. The authors argued not only that Jesus and Magdalene had children, but that their descendants survived as the Merovingians and beyond. They pointed to documents, genealogies, and patterns of suppression as evidence of a cover-up. While scholars criticized their methods, the book resonated because it gave form to centuries of suspicion. It offered a story in which the silences of history made sense, in which every missing tomb, every erased chronicle, every suppressed text was part of a grand conspiracy to hide the truth. And then came the 21st century, when the Da Vinci Code exploded into popular culture. Dan Brown's novel was fiction, yet it blurred fiction and fact so skillfully that millions of readers began to wonder anew about Magdalene, the Grail, and the Bloodline. Tourists descended on Paris, London, and the Languedoc, searching for the sites described in the novel. Priests in Rennes-le-Château suddenly found their tiny village besieged by visitors asking about Saunier's treasure. The Vatican issued statements condemning the book, yet in doing so only fanned the flames of curiosity. Once again, silence became suspicion, and suspicion became fuel. What all of this reveals is that the legend of the bloodline has never been static. It has evolved, adapted, absorbed new forms. In one century, it was a dynastic question. In another, it was a poetic metaphor. In another, still, it became a conspiracy theory. But through it all, the central theme remains unchanged. The possibility that the divine did not vanish at the ascension, but continued in flesh, in family, in the ordinary miracle of human inheritance. That possibility, whether true or not, has proven impossible to kill. Part 12, then, leaves us with this reflection. Perhaps the story's endurance is itself the most important fact. Myths that serve no purpose eventually die, but myths that speak to deep human needs for legitimacy, for continuity, for proximity to the divine, survive, no matter how often they are dismissed. The Merovingians, Magdalene, the Grail, the Priory of Sion, whether fact or fiction, they endure because they answer a question that official history refuses to ask. And so long as that question remains unanswered, the legend will not die. To push further into the depths of this narrative is to leave behind the neat lines of dynasties and chronicles, and to confront the realm of secrecy itself. For even if the sacred bloodline were more myth than fact, its persistence has been fueled by secrecy, and secrecy is often more powerful than truth. The very act of hiding something, whether real or imagined, creates a vacuum that human imagination rushes to fill. And in the case of the Merovingians, the Priory of Sion, the Templars, and Magdalene, that vacuum has lasted for centuries, generating layer after layer of story until the myth itself has become indistinguishable from history. Secrecy is not a passive state. It is an active strategy. The Vatican's vast archives, locked away from public view, are the most visible symbol of this. Rumors abound of scrolls hidden beneath Rome, documents never allowed to see daylight. Some claim the Church Guard's genealogical charts, others whisper of apocryphal gospels, still others of relics that contradict official doctrine. Whether these treasures truly exist or not, the secrecy itself serves a purpose. It signals that there are truths too dangerous for ordinary believers. When knowledge is forbidden, it acquires a strange glow of authenticity. The bloodline legend thrives on this glow. The lack of access becomes its strongest evidence. The same is true of Rennes-le-Château. Saunier's wealth, his coded inscriptions, his sudden rise and silence, all form a mystery that invites speculation. Tourists who climb the hill see not just a church, but a locked puzzle box. And when puzzles resist solution, they generate their own momentum. Every missing ledger, every ambiguous carving becomes another clue, another fragment of the hidden whole. Rennes-le-Château may never yield proof of a sacred lineage, but it will never cease to generate stories, because it resists closure. The Priory of Sion itself, whether hoax or hidden brotherhood, operates on the same principle. The very controversy about its authenticity keeps the idea alive. When Pierre Plantard admitted to fabricating documents, some dismissed the whole thing as fraud. Yet others asked, why admit unless pressured? Why create such elaborate genealogies, if not to conceal a kernel of truth in a cloak of invention? A perfect secret society may not need to exist in brick and mortar at all. Its existence is in the imagination it shapes, in the way it makes people search for patterns, symbols, and connections. In that sense, the Priory of Sion is real whether or not it was ever founded, because its secrecy has reshaped the way millions perceive history. This interplay between secrecy and imagination is most visible in the way symbols have been handled. Take the pentagram, for example. In medieval art, it often symbolized perfection, the human body, and the harmony of the universe. Later, it became associated with magic and secrecy. When carved on the walls of chapels in the Languedoc, it is not clear whether it was meant as geometry, devotion, or code. Yet once secrecy wrapped itself around the symbol, its meaning multiplied. People began to see in it whatever they most feared or desired. The same applies to the bee, the rose, the chalice, the fleur-de-lis. Secrecy does not erase symbols. It magnifies them, charging them with multiple, contradictory meanings. The psychology of secrecy also explains why the bloodline legend resonates so deeply in the modern world. In an age of distrust, when institutions are questioned, governments doubted, and official narratives challenged, secrecy becomes fertile ground for alternative histories. The less people trust authority, the more they believe in hidden truths. The legend of Christ's descendants speaks directly to this climate. It says that the greatest cover-up in history was not political corruption or royal scandal, but the concealment of humanity's direct link to the divine. This resonates in a world where people suspect that the most important truths are precisely those they are told never to ask. Yet secrecy also reshapes itself into ritual. Secret societies flourished not only because of what they believed, but because of how they practiced secrecy. To belong to the Freemasons or Rosicrucians was not simply to inherit ideas. It was to enact secrecy through symbols, handshakes, and allegories. Rituals create bonds stronger than evidence. They allow participants to feel they are guardians of something larger, even if they cannot articulate exactly what that something is. In this way, the guardians of the bloodline may never have needed the bloodline itself to survive. The secrecy around it was enough to perpetuate its power. Consider also the role of silence. When the Vatican condemns speculation about Magdalene as fantasy, the silence that follows becomes louder than denial. When Saunière died without explanation, his silence became more eloquent than confession. Silence is the perfect soil for myth, because it cannot be disproven. It creates an echo chamber in which every whisper sounds like revelation. And in the case of the sacred lineage, silence has been the constant companion. We never hear definitive answers, only absences, gaps, missing tombs, forbidden texts. Those absences speak louder than presence. Secrecy has also allowed the story to adapt. Each generation fills the vacuum with its own anxieties and hopes. Medieval knights saw in the Grail a symbol of chivalric purity. Renaissance artists saw Magdalene as the bearer of forbidden intimacy. Enlightenment secret societies saw the lineage as allegory for wisdom withheld from the masses. Modern readers see it as conspiracy, proof that institutions lie. The content shifts, but the structure, the hidden truth, the guardians, the silence, remains. In this way, secrecy ensures immortality. Part 13, then, reveals that the legend of the sacred bloodline may never require proof to endure. Its power lies precisely in secrecy. It is the locked archive, the missing manuscript, the tomb that cannot be found, the confession never made. Secrecy transforms history into myth, and myth into destiny. Whether or not the Merovingians carried Christ's blood, whether or not Magdalene bore a child, whether or not the Priory of Sion exists, the secrecy itself ensures the story's survival. For as long as there are locked doors, as long as silence hangs where words should be, the imagination will fill the void. And in that void, the bloodline lives on, not only as history, but as one of the greatest secrets never fully revealed. To follow the trail further is to realize that the legend of the sacred bloodline has always existed in two dimensions at once: the external one of politics, war, and dynasties, and the internal one of myth, symbol, and dream. The outer story has been told in chronicles, battles, treaties, and papal decrees. The inner story has lived in art, ritual, and whispers carried through generations. By now, the two layers have fused so tightly that it is almost impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. What seems clear is that the myth has persisted not simply because of historical anomalies, but because it touches a deeper truth about how humans perceive power, inheritance, and the sacred. Take, for instance, the role of landscape. Southern France has always been more than backdrop to the legend. It has been one of its central characters. The hills of the Languedoc, the caves of Saint-Baume, the ruins of Montségur, the rivers that carve through valleys. These places carry memory like stone tablets. Pilgrims climb the cave where Mary Magdalene is said to have prayed, lighting candles against its damp walls, hearing the echo of chants that have lingered for centuries. The cave becomes not just a site of devotion, but a vessel of continuity, a physical reminder of a lineage that may or may not exist in blood, but unquestionably exists in tradition. The castles of the Cathars, perched on impossible cliffs, also embody this duality. To the eye, they are ruins, fragments of walls clinging to rock, but to those who know their history, they are altars of resistance. Montségur, the most famous, was the site of the Cathars' last stand. When the fortress fell in 1244, more than 200 believers were burned alive. The story that 4 Cathars escaped with a hidden treasure has endured, not because treasure was ever found, but because it resonates with the archetype of continuity. Even in defeat, something survived. Whether that something was gold, manuscripts, or a lineage, the legend insists it escaped the flames. And so Montségur remains not only a ruin, but a beacon, a place where memory itself refused to die. In such landscapes, folklore often acts as a second archive. Songs, proverbs, and local tales preserve fragments that written chronicles omitted. In villages near the Pyrenees, stories still circulate about la descendance cachée, the hidden descent. These tales are never explicit. They hint, they suggest, they veil, but they keep alive the idea that not all heirs were extinguished, that some continued quietly in obscurity. Folklore is rarely precise, but it often preserves echoes of truths official history cannot contain. Symbols also act as landscapes of memory. The rose, for instance, has long been tied to secrecy. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, meant confidentiality in ancient times, and in Christian mysticism, the rose came to represent both suffering and hidden knowledge. Rosicrucians in the 17th century built entire manifestos around the rose and cross, declaring themselves heirs of secret wisdom. For those who connect the dots, the rose becomes another mask for the Grail, the bloodline, the lineage that could never be named directly. Similarly, the star, the chalice, and the bee persist across centuries, carried from one context to another, their meanings shifting yet never extinguished. But if landscapes and symbols carry memory, so too do silences. One of the most striking features of this story is not what is remembered, but what is absent. Dagobert II's tomb is missing. Cathar manuscripts are gone. The Vatican archives remain sealed. Each absence becomes a presence in its own right, an unspoken testimony. In psychology, silence often signals trauma. In history, it often signals suppression. What is not said becomes more eloquent than what is declared. The bloodline legend thrives precisely because it grows in these silences, like roots in the dark. In the 19th century, secrecy itself became fashionable. Societies like the Freemasons thrived on allegory and ritual, creating elaborate systems of initiation that mirrored the very structure of the bloodline myth. Members were told they were inheritors of ancient wisdom, guardians of secrets stretching back to Solomon's temple. Whether or not this was true was irrelevant. What mattered was the feeling of continuity, the sense of belonging to a chain that could not be broken. The myth of the sacred lineage dovetailed perfectly with this cultural moment. It offered not just mystery, but identity, not just speculation, but participation in something larger. The 20th century expanded this impulse into global culture. Films, novels, and even tourism industries sprang up around the idea. Suddenly, ordinary people could walk the streets of Paris or the hills of Languedoc and imagine themselves part of the quest. To stand in Rennes-le-Château was to stand inside a riddle. To enter the Louvre and stare at the Last Supper or the Madonna of the Rocks was to join a global treasure hunt for secrets encoded in art. The myth democratized itself, no longer the domain of scholars or secret societies, but of anyone willing to follow the trail. What makes this democratization so compelling is that it reveals how myths evolve. At first, they are guarded by elites, priests, kings, secret orders. Later, they seep into culture at large, shaping literature, art, and collective imagination. By the 21st century, the sacred bloodline had become not just a historical speculation, but a cultural archetype. It appeared in novels like The Da Vinci Code, in television documentaries, in endless internet forums where seekers pieced together fragments into new mosaics. The myth is no longer confined to history books. It lives in the public mind, renewed with each retelling, and yet, even as it proliferates, the myth retains its power because it resists final revelation. No document has ever surfaced that proves the lineage beyond doubt. No DNA test has unveiled descendants of Christ. Every lead ends in ambiguity, every clue in contradiction, but this is precisely why the legend endures. Proof would kill it, turning mystery into fact, story into history. Ambiguity keeps it alive, inviting each generation to interpret, to search, to believe or disbelieve. The Grail, after all, was never meant to be found easily. It was meant to remain elusive, a mirror reflecting the seeker's own longing. Part 14, then, reveals that the sacred bloodline may be less about history than about human need. The need for continuity, for legitimacy, for proximity to the divine. The need to believe that our world hides mysteries still waiting to be uncovered. Whether or not Christ's blood flows in human veins, the story insists that something sacred has survived, guarded in landscapes, symbols, and silences. It may not be provable, but it is undeniable in its endurance. And that endurance itself is its greatest power, a living myth, woven into the stones of cathedrals, the ruins of castles, the rituals of pilgrims, and the imagination of all who dare to ask what lies beneath the silence of history. To move deeper still into the myth of the sacred bloodline is to confront its most unsettling implication, that if such a lineage exists, then it has always been both a threat and a promise. A threat to institutions built on the idea that divinity cannot be inherited, and a promise to those who long for a more direct connection between heaven and earth. This tension has shaped not only the legend's survival, but its continual reinvention. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the way it has intersected with movements of rebellion, reform, and revolution throughout history. Consider first the Cathars. Their dualistic theology, seeing the world as a battleground between light and darkness, posed a fundamental challenge to the Catholic Church. They rejected sacraments, denied the authority of Rome, and lived with a purity that embarrassed their critics. For the Church, this was heresy. For the people of Languedoc, it was liberation. But what made the Cathars particularly dangerous was not just their theology, but the suspicion that they preserved documents or traditions linked to a hidden lineage. When Montségur fell, and 4 Cathars were said to have escaped with a treasure, what mattered was not whether it was gold or parchment, but the idea that continuity had survived massacre. The Cathars were not merely heretics. They were potential guardians of the forbidden story. Centuries later, during the Reformation, when Luther nailed his theses and cracked open the monopoly of Rome, echoes of the bloodline resurfaced in the imagination of dissenters. Some reformers whispered that the Catholic Church suppressed more than Scripture, that it buried entire genealogies that would destabilize its power. Though such claims never entered formal Protestant doctrine, they fanned the flames of suspicion. If Rome had lied about indulgences, what else had it concealed? The possibility of a bloodline fit perfectly into this climate of distrust. A silent accusation that authority itself rested on a cover-up. Revolution, too, carried the myth forward. In 18th century France, as the monarchy collapsed, pamphlets circulated suggesting that hidden heirs might yet reclaim the throne. Sometimes these pamphlets spoke of lost Bourbons, but other times they hinted at far older lines, forgotten claimants who traced descent not just to kings, but to Christ himself. In the chaos of revolution, legitimacy was up for grabs, and the bloodline myth became a weapon. A way to imagine an alternative order, rooted not in papal blessing or aristocratic privilege, but in something primordial. Even Napoleon's use of the bee symbol can be seen in this light, an attempt to seize the aura of the Merovingians, to present himself not as usurper, but as heir to a sacred continuity. The myth also aligned with esoteric and mystical movements that sought to challenge materialism. In the 19th century, occultists like Eliphas Levi and later theosophists like Helena Blavatsky absorbed fragments of the legend into their broader cosmologies. They spoke of hidden masters, sacred currents, and bloodlines that carried wisdom through the ages. For them, the Merovingians were not merely kings, but incarnations of a spiritual continuity stretching back to ancient Egypt and beyond. Such claims blurred history and myth entirely, but they reveal how adaptable the bloodline story had become. It could be woven into theology, rebellion, mysticism, or nationalism, always taking on the colors of its context while preserving its core suggestion that something sacred survives in silence. What makes this adaptability so enduring is its resonance with human longing. Every age has asked in its own way whether the divine is distant or near, abstract or embodied. The bloodline legend answers by saying, "It is near, it is embodied, it flows in veins." For ordinary people, this transforms the idea of salvation from something mediated by institutions into something intimate. For rulers, It transforms legitimacy from something granted by popes into something rooted in ancestry. And for rebels, it transforms hope from something deferred to eternity into something hidden in the here and now. That flexibility explains why the myth has never died. But adaptability comes with danger. The same myth that offers hope can also be exploited. In the 20th century, fringe movements and pseudo-historians seized upon the bloodline theory to justify racial ideologies. They twisted the story into claims of pure blood, using the language of sacred descent to fuel exclusion and supremacy. This is perhaps the darkest shadow of the legend, that a myth meant to connect humanity to the divine could be manipulated to divide humanity against itself. Such distortions remind us that myths are never innocent. They carry the power to inspire or to destroy, depending on how they are wielded. And yet, despite distortions, the deeper current of the story remains strangely luminous. At its heart, it is less about exclusion and more about continuity. The figure of Mary Magdalene, carrying her child into exile, represents survival against overwhelming force. The Merovingians, erased from chronicles, represent memory that refuses to vanish. The Cathars at Montségur, consumed by fire yet rumored to have preserved a treasure, represent the idea that truth can outlive destruction. These are archetypes of persistence, resilience, and hidden hope. One could argue that the story's endurance proves nothing about its factual truth, but everything about its symbolic truth. Symbolically, the bloodline insists that power need not flow from institutions, that the sacred can be embodied in ordinary flesh, that continuity survives even when authority tries to erase it. This symbolic truth is perhaps why the story has been embraced by so many different movements, because it provides a language for resistance against the official narrative, a reminder that silence can conceal survival. Part 15, then, lingers on this paradox. The sacred bloodline may be the most potent myth of survival in Western history. It has been invoked by heretics, reformers, revolutionaries, mystics, emperors, and novelists. It has been condemned by the Church, mocked by scholars, embraced by seekers, and distorted by extremists. And through all of this, it has never been extinguished. Whether it exists in fact or only in imagination, its endurance reveals something about us. Our hunger for continuity, our suspicion of authority, our longing for the divine to be near, embodied, and human. Perhaps this is why the legend has never faded. For in the end, the bloodline is not just about Christ or the Merovingians or the Priory of Sion. It is about the human refusal to accept silence as the final word, the insistence that what is hidden may still survive, waiting to be remembered. To push further into this legend is to recognize that the story of the sacred bloodline is not confined to dusty manuscripts or ruined castles. It has seeped into modern consciousness, reshaping itself into questions that haunt us even today. If there is one thread that explains its survival across so many centuries, it is the way the legend constantly reinvents itself to meet the needs of each new era. It is less like a static tale and more like a living organism, mutating with every retelling, yet preserving its core suggestion. That something sacred was hidden, that a truth too explosive to announce outright was buried beneath layers of silence and symbol. In the 20th century, this reinvention became more visible than ever. The publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1982 took scattered fragments, the Merovingians, Magdalene, the Priory of Sion, the Templars, and wove them into a sweeping conspiracy theory that promised to explain centuries of silence. The book presented the idea that Jesus and Magdalene were married, that their descendants became the Merovingian kings of France, and that the Priory of Sion was a secret society sworn to protect their heirs. Though historians attacked the book for its speculative leaps and lack of proof, readers devoured it because it offered coherence where history offered only gaps. The very absence of evidence was reinterpreted as confirmation of suppression. In a skeptical age, where faith in institutions had waned, the suggestion that truth was hidden by those institutions resonated powerfully. The story leapt again into global imagination with Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. This novel, blending fact, fiction, and speculation, brought the legend to millions who had never heard of the Merovingians or Rennes-le-Château. Suddenly, ordinary readers were tracing genealogies, poring over Da Vinci's paintings, and visiting obscure French villages in search of clues. The book blurred the line between scholarship and storytelling, but that blurring itself was part of its success. It mirrored the very structure of the legend, history and myth woven so tightly that they cannot be separated. In condemning the novel, the Church only fanned the flames, repeating a pattern as old as the Cathars. Silence and suppression only deepened suspicion. What these modern retellings reveal is that the legend has become archetypal. It no longer matters whether the Merovingians truly carried Christ's blood. What matters is that the story speaks to a universal longing, the longing to believe that divinity is not locked in distant heaven, but present here, embodied, transmitted in ways that escape control. This longing explains why the legend has survived massacres, inquisitions, ridicule, and centuries of silence. Each generation reimagines it not because it is proven, but because it is needed. But need itself raises questions. Why do we need this story? Perhaps because it challenges the boundaries we are taught to accept. The Church insists on separation. Christ divine, humanity fallen, authority centralized in Rome. The Bloodline legend dissolves those boundaries, insisting instead that the divine and human mingled not just in one miraculous body, but in a family, in children, in a line that continued. That idea is profoundly destabilizing, but it is also profoundly comforting. It suggests that the sacred is not beyond us, but within us, flowing in veins, hiding in ordinary families. For a world weary of institutions, it offers an alternative vision of holiness. This explains why the legend has found fertile soil in modern skepticism. We live in an age where official narratives are questioned, where secrecy breeds suspicion, where people instinctively believe that what is denied must be true. The Bloodline legend is the ultimate forbidden story. It says, the greatest cover-up in history is not political scandal or war, but the erasure of Christ's heirs. In this way, the legend aligns perfectly with the psychology of conspiracy. It does not require proof. It thrives on doubt. Every absence of evidence is interpreted as evidence of absence. Every denial is taken as confirmation. The story is immune to disproof because its very structure feeds on suppression. Yet even if one sets aside the conspiracy, the symbolic truth remains. The Grail as womb, Magdalene as vessel, the Merovingians as heirs. These images operate on levels deeper than history. They speak to archetypes of continuity, survival, and resilience. The image of Magdalene carrying a child across the sea is one of the most potent archetypes of exile and hope in Western imagination. The idea of heirs hidden in obscurity, waiting for recognition, echoes myths from Arthurian Britain to messianic traditions in Judaism. The bloodline story survives because it resonates with patterns older than Christianity itself. It is less about fact than about the human need for meaning in the face of silence. And silence remains the story's strongest ally. The Vatican's archives are locked. Rennes-le-Château's puzzles remain unsolved. Dagobert's tomb is missing. Cathar manuscripts are lost. Each absence is a wound in history, and into those wounds the imagination pours its salve. If the archives were suddenly opened, if the tombs were unearthed, if the manuscripts were revealed, the legend might finally be settled. But until then, the silence itself is more powerful than any revelation. It keeps the story alive because it allows each generation to project its own fears and hopes into the void. There is also the question of guardianship. Whether or not the Priory of Sion ever existed, the idea of guardians resonates deeply. We like to believe that truths too dangerous for the world are nonetheless preserved somewhere, guarded by initiates until humanity is ready. This motif appears in every culture: hidden masters, secret orders, wise ones in exile. The priory is simply the Western version of this archetype. It does not matter whether it is factually real. What matters is that it gives structure to the hope that nothing sacred is ever truly lost, that even when erased from chronicles, truth is preserved in silence, waiting for the right time to return. Part 16, then, shows us that the sacred bloodline has become less about kings and more about archetypes, less about dynasties and more about psychology. It is not simply a claim about who ruled France in the 7th century. It is a story about who we are, about whether the divine and human are truly separate, about whether silence means absence or survival. And perhaps that is the real reason the legend endures, because it tells us that erasure is never final, that suppression is never complete, that what is hidden in silence may still live, waiting for us to notice. In that sense, the bloodline is not only about the past, it is about the present. It is about us, about the mysteries we inherit, the truths we long for, the questions we dare to ask when history falls silent. The further we move into this story, the more it becomes clear that the sacred bloodline is not only a matter of theology or medieval history, but a mirror for modern anxieties. Legends survive because they adapt, and this one has adapted into the language of our time: secrecy, power, and hidden inheritance. In every century, it has reflected humanity's deepest fears and longings, but in our era, it resonates in new ways. It has become entangled with questions about who controls truth, who writes history, and what happens when silence itself becomes the loudest evidence of all. In the 20th century, especially after the World Wars, the bloodline myth intersected with the politics of legitimacy in unsettling ways. Authoritarian regimes thrived on myth, wrapping themselves in symbols of destiny and sacred inheritance. Some fringe groups claimed descent from ancient lines, twisting the idea of sacred blood into racial ideology. What had once been about Magdalene's survival and a hidden continuity of Christ's lineage became distorted into fantasies of purity and supremacy. This was the darkest shadow of the legend, that a story about divinity embodied in human blood could be weaponized to divide humanity. Yet even in distortion, the core idea persisted, the belief that blood itself carried destiny, that lineage was not only a matter of genealogy, but of meaning. After the wars, when the world turned to rebuilding, the legend found new ground in the cultural fascination with hidden orders and suppressed truths. Secret societies, once the province of fringe mystics, became mainstream obsessions. The Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, these groups became part of public imagination, whether or not their influence was real. And folded into that same imagination was the Priory of Sion, a name whispered first in documents of questionable authenticity and later immortalized by novels. Whether the priory ever existed hardly matters anymore. It exists in the cultural mind, where it plays the role of guardian, protecting a truth too explosive for daylight. The myth also intersected with the rise of archaeology and the rediscovery of apocryphal texts. The Nag Hammadi Library, unearthed in 1945, revealed Gospels long lost to history: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary. These texts portrayed a Christianity richer, stranger, and more diverse than the official canon. Magdalene appeared in these texts not as penitent prostitute, but as leader, confidant, and inheritor of secret teachings. For those already inclined to believe in a sacred bloodline, the rediscovery of these texts was fuel. They did not prove lineage, but they proved suppression. They showed that the early church had silenced voices it could not control. And once suppression is admitted, imagination rushes to fill the silence with what might have been buried: a family, a line, a continuity that changes everything. The legend also resonates with the way we see history itself. We live in an age where archives are digitized, where secrets leak, where suppressed information finds its way into public view. Yet the Vatican archives remain sealed, guarded, inaccessible to ordinary eyes. To many, this inaccessibility itself is proof that something is hidden. Why keep centuries of documents locked away unless they contain truths too dangerous to reveal? The locked door is more powerful than any open one, for it invites speculation. Every sealed manuscript becomes another possible piece of the bloodline story. In this way, secrecy is not just protection, it is provocation. In modern literature and film, the myth has been recast as a quest for identity. The Grail is no longer only an object of power, but a symbol of self-discovery. Heroes chase riddles through libraries, museums, and cathedrals, not just to find treasure, but to uncover who they really are. This mirrors the original legend, which was never about a cup, but about continuity, not about possession, but about recognition. To seek the Grail is to seek the hidden inheritance, the truth that has been erased. And in the modern world, where identity is often fragmented, the Grail becomes a metaphor for wholeness, the dream that by uncovering the hidden past, we can also uncover ourselves. The myth also speaks to the fear that history itself is manipulated. If a bloodline could be erased from chronicles, if saints could be silenced, if manuscripts could be burned, then perhaps all of history is subject to the same erasures. The bloodline story becomes the ultimate example of history written by the victors, and of truths buried by institutions. For some, it is not even about Christ's descendants specifically, but about the broader suspicion that nothing we are told is complete, that the official story is always hiding another story beneath. In this sense, the sacred bloodline is not only a legend, It is a metaphor for history itself, fragile, fractured, shaped by power, always concealing as much as it reveals. And yet, even amidst skepticism, the myth retains a luminous quality. For all its speculation and distortion, it remains a story about survival. Magdalene carrying a child across the sea. The Cathars slipping away from Montségur with their treasure. Families in Languedoc whispering about hidden heirs. Priests in obscure villages guarding secrets they never confessed. These are images of persistence, of memory refusing to die. They are reminders that even when chronicles are erased, stories can survive in symbols, rituals, and silence. This resilience is why the legend endures, not because it is provable, but because it cannot be erased. Part 17, then, stands at the edge of the modern world, where the sacred bloodline is no longer just medieval rumor, but cultural archetype. It has become a story we tell to explain silence, to challenge authority, to comfort ourselves with the hope that divinity is not distant but near. Whether it lives in genealogies or in symbols, in hidden manuscripts or in novels, the legend endures because it answers questions that history cannot. What survives when everything else is erased? What truths remain locked behind sealed doors? And what if the divine is not only in heaven, but still alive in human blood? The story of the sacred bloodline, by this stage in our exploration, has become less about whether it is true and more about how it continues to live. Myths that refuse to die often outgrow their origins, transforming into symbols that carry meaning far beyond their initial context. The Merovingians may have been a dynasty erased from chronicles. Mary Magdalene may or may not have carried a child to southern France. The Priory of Sion may be a hoax or a hidden brotherhood. But the legend has long since become something larger. It has become a vessel for questions that cannot be answered by evidence alone. One of these questions is about authority. For 2 millennia, religious and political institutions have insisted on controlling the narrative of history. To challenge those narratives is to challenge the very foundation of authority. This is why the bloodline story is so subversive. It suggests that the greatest authority of all, the Church itself, may have been built upon a deliberate act of erasure. If Christ had children, if Magdalene carried forward his line, then authority does not belong to Rome or to papal decrees, but to descendants. That possibility is not only destabilizing, it is revolutionary. And so the story persists because it embodies the dream that truth belongs not to institutions, but to life itself, to blood, to continuity beyond control. Another question the legend raises is about secrecy. Why do locked doors captivate us so deeply? Why do we assume that what is hidden must be precious? The Vatican's archives are the most famous example, but secrecy pervades the entire story. Saunier's unexplained wealth, the missing tomb of Dagobert II, the vanished Cathar manuscripts. Each silence, each absence, becomes more evocative than presence. In this way, the legend thrives on emptiness. It is like a constellation, defined not only by stars but by the dark spaces between them. What we cannot see is what makes the pattern compelling. The story also touches something primal, the human longing for continuity. Death interrupts, history fractures, empires collapse. But the idea of a bloodline that persists is an antidote to impermanence. It says that even when dynasties fall and chronicles are burned, something survives, carried quietly forward in the veins of ordinary people. Whether or not that something is divine blood, the idea itself soothes the anxiety of loss. To believe in a hidden lineage is to believe in permanence, in the survival of the sacred, even in the face of erasure. In modern times, this longing for continuity has taken new forms. We see it in the fascination with genealogy, in the explosion of DNA testing, in the search for ancestral roots. People want to know where they come from, and in that search, the myth of the sacred bloodline becomes the ultimate genealogy. It says, "Your ancestry is not only human, it is divine." For many, that possibility is too seductive to dismiss. Even if evidence is lacking, the story offers meaning. And meaning, more than proof, is what myths provide. Yet the legend also contains a paradox. If the bloodline exists, why remain hidden? Why not reveal itself and overturn the structures of authority? The answer, woven into the myth itself, is that humanity is not ready. The Priory of Sion, if it exists, guards the truth until the world can receive it without collapse. This motif, the truth must be protected until the right moment, appears in countless traditions. It is the messianic hope in Judaism, the return of Arthur in Britain, the sleeping kings in folklore who will awaken when needed. The bloodline legend joins this chorus, insisting that what is hidden is not lost, but waiting. Waiting requires secrecy, and secrecy requires guardians. And so the story continues, suspended in time, forever on the threshold of revelation. The Grail itself embodies this paradox. In the romances, knights never simply find it. They must be prepared, purified, transformed. The Grail is not just an object, but a mirror, revealing worthiness or unworthiness. So too with the bloodline. If it is ever revealed, it will demand recognition, not possession. It is not treasure to be seized, but continuity to be honored. This is why the legend insists on guardianship. Those who protect it are not hoarding gold, but ensuring that revelation, if it comes, will come in the right way, at the right time. The bloodline also intersects with questions of identity on a collective scale. Nations, dynasties, and religions all ground themselves in origin stories. To disrupt those origins is to destabilize identity itself. If France's first kings were heirs of Christ, what does that mean for later monarchies who ruled by papal blessing? If Magdalene carried the true inheritance, what does that mean for Peter and his successors? The bloodline legend unsettles the very foundations of identity, suggesting that legitimacy may lie elsewhere than where authority has always claimed. This unsettling effect explains why the legend has been suppressed, mocked, or ridiculed. It is not merely a curiosity, it is a threat. And yet, there is another possibility, that the legend's power does not lie in its literal truth, but in its symbolic one. Symbolically, the bloodline tells us that the divine and human are not separate, that holiness is not abstract, but embodied, that survival is not institutional, but biological, ordinary, human. To imagine Magdalene as Grail is to imagine that the sacred lives in women as well as men, in family as well as church, in continuity as well as rupture. This symbolic truth is perhaps why the story has been embraced not only by seekers of conspiracy, but by artists, poets, and mystics. It offers a vision of holiness that is intimate, immediate, and human. Part 18, then, rests on this realization, that the sacred bloodline is not only about the past, but about the present. It is about how we understand authority, secrecy, continuity, identity, and the meaning of the divine in human life. Whether it exists, in fact, may matter less than the way it has shaped imagination. For centuries, people have been drawn to it not because it is proven, but because it refuses to die. It survives in silence, in symbols, in landscapes, in art, and in the restless human heart that refuses to accept that everything sacred has already been revealed. Perhaps this is the bloodline's true survival, not in veins or genealogies, but in the persistence of a question we cannot stop asking. What if divinity walked into the world not only as spirit, but as family? And what if that family still lives? The further one journeys into this story, the more it begins to resemble a mirror held up to civilization itself. For the legend of the sacred bloodline has always been less about hidden kings than about the anxieties and desires of the societies that retell it. Each generation has reshaped it, not simply out of curiosity, but because it speaks to something they lack, something they crave. In medieval times, it offered hope that continuity could survive even amid plagues and wars. In the Renaissance, it reflected a thirst for suppressed wisdom. In the Enlightenment, it symbolized resistance to institutional authority. And in the modern age, it has become a parable of secrecy, conspiracy, and the fragility of truth itself. This adaptability is its greatest strength. Myths that do not change with the times vanish, but those that bend and evolve survive. The bloodline legend has endured precisely because it is not locked in a single form. Sometimes it is about the Merovingians, sometimes the Cathars, sometimes secret societies, sometimes Magdalene herself. At times it is presented as literal genealogy, at others as allegory, at others as psychological archetype. Yet through all these transformations, one theme remains: the idea that the divine did not vanish but continued, hidden in human continuity. That constancy gives the legend its pulse, its rhythm, its strange immortality. Modern culture has amplified the legend in ways no medieval chronicler could have imagined. Films, novels, television shows, and endless online forums have spread it across the world. What once whispered in cloisters now thunders in multiplexes. A visitor to Rennes-le-Château today does not find a quiet village, but a tourist site buzzing with seekers, each hoping to glimpse a clue that will unlock the riddle. Guides point to Saunière's church, its bizarre statues and inscriptions. Bookshelves are filled with theories. Each generation of visitors rewrites the puzzle, seeing in it whatever they bring: romance, conspiracy, mysticism, rebellion. The church itself has become less a place of worship than a stage upon which the legend plays itself again and again. In this globalized form, the bloodline story has become an emblem of modern suspicion. We live in an age where official narratives are distrusted, where people instinctively believe that what is hidden must be truth. The bloodline is the ultimate hidden story, and so it thrives. Every denial by authority becomes confirmation. Every gap in the record becomes a doorway to speculation. The legend has adapted perfectly to the psychology of conspiracy, where proof is less important than pattern, where absence itself becomes evidence. And so the myth thrives not despite lack of proof, but because of it. Yet alongside suspicion lies longing. The legend appeals because it offers intimacy with the divine. Official religion often feels abstract, mediated by rituals and hierarchies. The bloodline story says otherwise: that holiness walked in human flesh, loved, married, had children, and continued in ordinary veins. To imagine Magdalene carrying her child across the sea, to imagine generations of hidden heirs surviving massacres and erasures, is to imagine a divine that is close, vulnerable, and human. That intimacy is more powerful than dogma. It is not about believing in institutions, but about believing in family, in continuity, in the persistence of life itself. This longing explains why the story resonates so deeply with individuals searching for identity. In a world where many feel rootless, cut off from ancestry, the bloodline offers a narrative of connection. It whispers that lineage is not only human, but sacred. It transforms the search for family trees into a search for divinity. Even if no one can trace their genealogy to Magdalene or the Merovingians, the idea that someone might, that sacredness could run in human blood, offers a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. But the legend also raises unsettling questions. If such a bloodline exists, what would happen if it were revealed? Would the descendants be venerated or hunted? Would they become symbols of hope or targets of power? The myth itself suggests both possibilities. That is why guardianship is always central. Whether through the priory of Sion, the Templars, or hidden families in Languedoc, the story insists that the bloodline has always been protected, concealed from those who would exploit it. And in that concealment lies the paradox. Revelation would destroy what secrecy has preserved. Perhaps this is why the legend has never resolved. It is safer as a question than as an answer. This unresolved quality is what gives the myth its dreamlike persistence. It functions like a riddle without solution, a door that never fully opens. Each attempt to prove or disprove it only strengthens its allure. Scholars dismiss it, and yet the public returns to it. The Church condemns it, and yet pilgrims light candles for Magdalene. Writers fictionalize it, and yet readers ask whether the fiction conceals fact. Like the Grail itself, it is most powerful not when found, but when sought. The seeking is the point. And so the bloodline story has become one of the great collective quests of Western imagination. It is a quest for continuity in the face of rupture, for intimacy in the face of distance, for hidden truth in the face of silence. It asks questions institutions cannot answer. What if the divine is not only in heaven? What if it lives in flesh, in family, in us? These questions are not easily dismissed because they are not only historical, they are existential. They touch on what it means to be human, what it means to long for the sacred, what it means to refuse the silence of authority. Part 19, then, leaves us with the recognition that the bloodline story is no longer confined to its origins. It has become a mirror for modernity itself. It reflects our suspicion of authority, our hunger for continuity, our fascination with secrecy, our longing for the divine in human form. Whether true or not, it survives because it speaks to needs that history cannot satisfy. It endures because it offers not only a challenge to authority, but a promise to humanity, that what is erased is not always gone, that what is hidden may still live, and that perhaps the greatest truths are not in archives or chronicles, but in the silences we cannot stop trying to fill. To arrive at the final turn of this journey is to realize that the legend of the sacred bloodline may never resolve, and perhaps it was never meant to. The Grail was always elusive, glimpsed only by the worthy, revealed only in fragments. So too, with the bloodline, It is a mystery that thrives not on proof, but on persistence, not on resolution, but on resonance. It survives because it cannot be settled, because it is larger than history, larger than theology, larger even than the dynasties and sects that have carried its whispers. To speak of it now is to stand not at the end of a story, but at the edge of a horizon, where silence stretches forward as far as it stretches back. If one looks backward, the fragments are there. The Merovingian kings with their bees and long hair, their tombs erased or misplaced. Dagobert II murdered and forgotten, his cult dissolved. Sigisbert IV carried into obscurity. Cathars massacred, but their treasure rumored to have survived. The Templars rising and falling, accused of secrets too dangerous to name. The Priory of Sion, half hoax, half myth, yet still echoing. Magdalene herself, recast, diminished, yet never silenced, her image surviving in art, in shrines, in devotion. Each fragment by itself is anomaly. Together they form a constellation, a pattern that insists on being seen even when its meaning is denied. If one looks forward, the legend continues to shape imagination. Tourists still climb the hill of Rennes-le-Château. Pilgrims still honor Sarah Lacaille at Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. Writers still weave the Grail into novels, films, operas. Scholars still argue about apocryphal gospels. And the Vatican still keeps its archives sealed, fueling the suspicion that silence is the greatest confirmation of all. The myth endures not because it has been proven, but because it has been needed, because it fills a void that neither history nor theology has ever been able to satisfy. What then is the void? Perhaps it is the longing for a divine that is not distant but near. Official doctrine places Christ in heaven, ascended, gone. The Bloodline legend insists otherwise, that he remained through Magdalene, through children, through lineage. It offers a vision of the divine that is not abstract but embodied, not mediated by institutions but transmitted by family, blood, and memory. For many, this is scandalous. For others, it is liberating. It is an inversion of power, a reimagining of holiness, a reminder that the sacred may live not in cathedrals, but in veins. Or perhaps the void is about continuity. History is filled with ruptures, wars, plagues, inquisitions, revolutions. The Bloodline offers continuity, the assurance that something survived. It says, even when chronicles are erased, something lived on. Even when castles burned, something was carried away. Even when saints were condemned and manuscripts destroyed, something hid itself, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In this sense, the legend is less about genealogy than about hope, the hope that nothing sacred is ever fully lost, that silence itself may preserve as much as it erases. There is also the question of guardianship. The myth insists that the bloodline, if it exists, has always been protected. By Cathars fleeing Montségur, by Templars digging beneath Jerusalem, by secret orders like the Priory, by families preserving symbols and heraldry. Whether these guardians existed in fact or in imagination hardly matters anymore. The very idea of guardianship comforts. It says that truths too fragile for daylight are not abandoned, but held in silence until they can be revealed. It reminds us that not all things are for every age, that some secrets require centuries of darkness before they can be seen. And yet, revelation never comes. Or rather, it always comes in fragments, rumors, symbols, texts rediscovered, novels that blend fact and fiction. The Grail is glimpsed but never seized. The Bloodline is suggested but never proven. This is perhaps the greatest paradox. The legend's power lies in its refusal to resolve. If proof were discovered tomorrow, DNA linking a modern family to Christ, what then? The myth would collapse into fact, powerful but finite. It is ambiguity that gives it endless life, ambiguity that keeps it alive across centuries, ambiguity that turns absence into presence. So the legend remains what it has always been, a threshold. To cross into it is not to discover final answers, but to enter a space where history and myth blur, where silence and symbol speak louder than chronicles. To listen to the story is to hear echoes of Magdalene on the shores of Provence, echoes of Cathars carrying treasure into the night, echoes of bees buried with kings, echoes of secrets locked in Vatican vaults. These echoes do not resolve into a single truth, but together they create a harmony that refuses to be silenced. Part 20, then, does not close the book but opens it wider. It leaves us not with certainty but with wonder. Perhaps there was a bloodline. Perhaps there was not. Perhaps the Merovingians carried it. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps the priory was guardian. Perhaps it was hoax. But whether or not the story is factual, it is undeniably real. Real in its persistence, real in its influence, real in the way it has shaped imagination for centuries. It is real because it will not die, because it continues to whisper in ruins, in art, in ritual, in silence. And maybe that is the true Grail. Not a cup, not a genealogy, but the persistence of mystery itself. A reminder that history is not closed, that silence is never empty, that what is hidden may still survive. In that sense, the bloodline is not only about Christ or Magdalene or the Merovingians. It is about us, about our refusal to accept erasure, about our hunger for the sacred in human form, about our insistence that what is hidden is worth seeking. The quest will never end because the quest is the point. The bloodline, whether in veins or in myth, is alive because we keep searching.